The night was unusually quiet along the forgotten stretch of coastline. No wind, no waves striking the sand, just an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes the world feel as if it's holding its breath. The moon hung low over the water, pale and watchful, casting a silver path across the surface like a doorway waiting to be crossed. And sometime before dawn, someone, or perhaps an entire small group, stepped through that doorway. Their footprints appeared long before anyone would ever know to look for them. Soft depressions in the untouched sand, some small, some larger, spaced in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than urgency. Whoever they were, they moved slowly, almost timidly, as if unsure whether this land would welcome them or swallow them whole. Those first faint marks were the earliest whispers of a story that would one day reshape a continent, yet in that moment they were simply evidence of survival. No one recorded their arrival, no names, no words, no markers, just the quiet night, the endless ocean behind them, and an unknown world ahead. The shoreline stretched in both directions, blank and patient, as if inviting them to decide which way history would begin. The travelers paused there, listening, not to danger, but to possibility. Somewhere in the dark, the forest rustled with unfamiliar sounds. A distant bird called out, lonely and curious. The newcomers must have wondered what waited beyond the tree line and whether they had the strength to face it. Yet they stepped forward, always forward. That small, almost invisible decision to enter rather than retreat became the silent beginning of an extraordinary journey. A journey that would remain hidden beneath centuries of dust and memory until someone chose to uncover it. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the cool sand beneath their feet, the heavy breath of the night, and the courage it took to walk into a land that offered no guarantees. Their story starts here, softly, without glory or noise, and soon you'll follow every step they take. If you're ready to drift deeper into this forgotten world, stay with me. Each moment ahead reveals another layer of their quiet arrival. The world they approached did not yet carry a name, not one spoken in their language, nor one etched in any memory they carried from across the waters. What stretched before them was simply land, land veiled in morning mist, land that breathed softly beneath towering forests, land that had never been mapped by any hand they knew. In the earliest days, before stories were written and borders were drawn, the place now known as America existed as nothing more than a quiet expanse of possibility. And the travelers, exhausted and hopeful, stepped toward it without understanding how profoundly it would shape the generations yet to come. They had not arrived all at once. Their journey had been a long unraveling of time, measured not by days or moons, but by survival. Long before the shoreline greeted them, they had lived through a kind of endless drifting, storms that rose without warning, nights without fire, mornings when the horizon offered nothing but empty water. Some of them had memories of homelands already fading, while others were too young to remember anything but the boat beneath their feet. They were not conquerors, and they were not explorers in the heroic sense the world would later imagine. They were wanderers guided by a blend of necessity and fragile hope. When the land finally appeared on the horizon, it must have seemed unreal, like a mirage forming out of sea light. The first reaction was not celebration, it was silent, a silence that carried both relief and uncertainty. To reach land meant safety from the water, but it also meant confronting the unknown. They knew nothing of the terrain, the creatures, or the people who might already call it home. And so the moment of landfall was filled with a quiet awe, as if they were witnessing the beginning of something too large to understand. In those earliest hours, the shore felt sacred. The sand beneath their feet was cool, almost damp from the night. Driftwood lay scattered like ancient bones. The trees loomed with dense canopies that blocked the sun, creating dark corridors they weren't yet ready to enter. No visible paths existed, only the natural shapes carved by wind, water, and time. But before they could explore even a single step inland, they had to rest. Their bodies needed stillness. They dropped their belongings, simple bundles of tools, stones, skins, onto the sand and breathed deeply. For the first time in many days, the ground did not sway beneath them. That alone felt like a miracle. Morning arrived slowly. The sun slipped over the edge of the water, revealing the true scale of the world ahead. Birds they had never seen before circled overhead. The air carried scents they couldn't name, a mix of pine and earth, moisture and bark, something sweet hidden in the foliage. Each breath felt like an introduction to a new rule of existence. As the day warmed, they began to move carefully along the shoreline. Their goal was simple: understand. The land might have been nameless to them, but every line, every sound, every shadow held meaning they would need to decipher. For thousands of years, this place had shaped itself without their influence. Now they had become part of its story, even if they didn't realize it. The waves rolled in with a steady rhythm, erasing the footprints they left behind. There was a strange comfort in that. If challenges arose, if they failed, the water would wash away the evidence. Nothing in this world felt permanent yet. It was a clean slate for them, even if they themselves were worn and scarred. As they walked, they discovered signs that life thrived here long before their arrival. Shells cracked open in patterns that suggested they had been eaten by animals. Tracks resembling those of deer crossed the sand. Farther inland, they found fallen trees hardened by age and fungi that glowed faintly in the shade. Everything pulsed with its own quiet energy. The land was not empty, it was alive and waiting. The travelers spoke very little. Speech felt unnecessary in a place that demanded observation, but their eyes communicated everything: curiosity, caution, wonder. A few of them pointed to distant hills that rose gently from the earth. Others watched the forest tree line as if expecting someone or something to step out and greet them. No one did. The silence was not threatening, only unfamiliar. They accepted it. Humans have always learned first by listening. By midday, they began discussing where to camp. They needed fresh water before anything else. Food would come later. Shelter would come after. They scanned the land for clues: vegetation that thickened, shifts in soil, the faint sound of flowing water. Eventually, one of them noticed a narrow stream running parallel to the coast. It wasn't large, but it would sustain them for now. They followed it inland. The moment they stepped beneath the forest canopy, the air changed. Light filtered through leaves in soft fragments. Insects buzzed gently around them. The trunks of ancient trees rose like pillars, holding the sky in place. The deeper they went, the more they realized the world had its own rhythm, slow and deliberate. It was a place unhurried by the concerns of humankind. As they walked, each step became part of a larger conversation between traveler and terrain. Moss cushioned their feet. Branches creaked above them. Shadows shifted, revealing glimpses of small creatures darting through the undergrowth. The forest was cautious of them, but not afraid. They reached a clearing just large enough to rest without feeling trapped. Sunlight fell directly onto the ground in a warm pool. This, they agreed, would be their temporary camp. They dropped their belongings, began gathering wood, and started the slow work of building fire. It was a humble beginning, nothing like the great settlements that would one day define civilizations, but it was enough. As the fire crackled, the sense of the unknown softened. The warmth reminded them of home, wherever that had been. They shared food, They mended their tools, they watched the sky change color as evening approached. The land, still nameless, watched over them. Night arrived gently. The stars spread across the sky in patterns they did not recognize. Constellations looked different here, as if the heavens themselves had rearranged to mark their arrival. They studied them silently, mapping possibilities for direction and timing. Even without clocks or compasses, they understood that the sky would guide them. The fire dimmed, and sleep settled like a blanket. But not all of them slept at once. A guardian kept watch, listening for danger. The forest spoke in whispers, rustling leaves, distant calls, the movement of nocturnal animals. Nothing approached their camp, yet the guardian remained vigilant. The first night on unknown land cannot be taken lightly. By dawn, they had made a decision. They would not attempt to conquer this world. They would learn from it, observe it, move with it rather than against it. This choice would define the culture they eventually formed, one rooted in quiet adaptation, respect, and resilience. Still, the land remained unnamed in their minds. They did not yet claim it. They merely acknowledged it as a place where life could continue. Days passed. They explored cautiously, following streams, tracing hills, and observing wildlife. Every discovery felt like a small revelation. They learned which plants were safe to touch, which fruits could be eaten, which trees held resin useful for fire. They learned the timing of tides, the behavior of birds, the way the wind shifted before rain. Slowly, the land revealed its secrets to those patient enough to listen. In return, the travelers offered nothing but their presence, quiet, humble, attentive. Weeks later, something changed. The land no longer felt like a stranger. It felt like a quiet companion. They had not named it, but they no longer needed to. It existed beyond language. The greatest shift occurred during a storm. The sky darkened unnaturally fast. Winds tore through the trees. Rain fell with a force they had rarely experienced. Their camp trembled, their fire died, and fear surged through them. They realized then that while the land had welcomed them, it also demanded resilience. Survival here required humility and adaptability. They had to build better shelters, store food, and read the sky more carefully. The storm passed by dawn. Trees lay broken, but their group remained intact. In that moment, something bonded them to the land more deeply than before. They understood now that this world would test them just as much as it sustained them. Time moved forward. Seasons shifted. The land introduced itself gradually, through blooming flowers, migrations of animals, the freezing grip of winter, the thawing warmth of spring. With each cycle, the travelers became less like strangers and more like an extension of the land itself. What they did not know was that thousands of years later, others would arrive with their own names for this place, names shaped by ambition, conquest, or ideology. But in these earliest days, when the world was quiet and untouched, the land held no title. It was simply the beginning, and the people who walked it were simply survivors searching for a future they could barely imagine. Before the new world had a name, it had a heartbeat, a rhythm older than memory, steady as the tide, and those first wanderers listened to it, slowly shaping their lives around its pulse. Their journey, however, was only beginning. Soon they would move beyond the coastline. Soon they would confront deeper mysteries, and soon their footsteps would spread farther than they ever dreamed. The world ahead was vast, and the story was far from over.
The ocean had always been a world unto itself, vast, indifferent, and ancient in a way human memory could never truly grasp. For the travelers who stepped onto its shifting surface, it was both a pathway and a test, stretching beyond imagination. Long before their feet touched the silent shore of the new land, long before their story blended with forests and rivers, They had endured a passage so immense that no one among them could ever fully describe it. No records were written, no carvings or symbols were left behind. What survived were only the echoes of the journey itself, echoes held in the minds of those who made it, quietly passed into the blood of generations. The sea greeted them with an unsettling calm on the day they began. It was the kind of stillness that felt deceptive, like an animal holding its breath before movement. Their vessels, simple, durable, shaped by patience rather than glory, rested softly against the tide. Made from wood, hide, and fiber, they were not masterpieces of craftsmanship, but rather stubborn declarations of necessity. They didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to float, endure, and move forward. They boarded with a silence that came not from fear, but from reverence. They knew the water demanded respect. The ocean listened to thoughts, they believed, and carried intentions across its endless span. So they stepped carefully, placing their belongings along the center of each boat. Tools, dried meat, skins filled with water, stones sacred to their previous home. None of them looked back at the fading shore they were leaving behind, not because they weren't sentimental, but because they couldn't afford to break the fragile resolve holding them together. Forward, always forward. No one knew how long they would be at sea. Time became a fluid concept the instant their homeland dissolved behind them. Days blended into each other, nights blurred without markers. The sky was their only clock, shifting colors in a slow, dependable rhythm. Sunrise meant hope. Sunset meant acceptance. Beyond that, nothing felt certain. The first few days were calm. The waves rocked them gently. The wind whispered directions, and the world seemed willing to guide them across. They traveled in clusters, 5 boats at the front, 3 behind, and more trailing in loose formation. Each carried families, elders, hunters, children too young to understand the magnitude of the journey. Their voices stayed low. Their breaths stayed measured. Noise, they believed, could disturb the delicate balance between humans and the sea. A few whispered stories to the children, stories of ancestors who had once crossed smaller waters, stories of birds guiding wanderers, stories of islands forming from the bones of ancient creatures. Whether the stories were true or not mattered little. In the middle of the ocean, the truth was whatever comfort allowed people to sleep. But as they moved farther from their point of departure, the water began revealing its true nature. The sea was not a friend or an enemy. It was a force, one that shifted moods without warning. On the 6th night, the wind changed. A low hum rose from the horizon, deep and resonant. Clouds gathered like silent sentinels. The air grew cold, sharp enough to sting the skin. The travelers recognized the signs. They had seen storms before, but never one this far from land, where the ocean felt bottomless. The waves rose first, not violently, but steadily, like breath filling a massive chest. Their boats lifted and dropped in slow, heavy motions. Children clung to the arms of their parents. The elders closed their eyes. Hunters tightened their grips on oars. Yet no one panicked. Fear was present, but controlled. They had learned long ago that panic was deadlier than water. The storm struck before dawn. A wall of wind swept across the sea, bending the boats like reeds. Rain pounded their backs. Lightning cracked open the sky, revealing glimpses of endless dark water stretching in every direction. For a moment, the ocean felt like a creature swallowing them whole. But even in the chaos, there was rhythm. The paddlers moved together, muscles straining, voices low but steady. The boats creaked and groaned, but they held. Their construction, simple yet resilient, proved its worth. Every lash of wind, every shudder of wood became part of the unfolding journey. Hours passed. The storm refused to relent. Some boats drifted apart, others collided gently, tied together with ropes that strained under the weight.
One boat capsized, but miraculously its passengers were pulled aboard neighboring vessels. No life was lost. Luck, or something more, seemed to hover around them like an unseen guardian. And then, as abruptly as it began, the storm surrendered. By mid-afternoon, the water calmed, the sky opened, the air warmed. The ocean shimmered with deceptive innocence, as if erasing the memory of the storm from its surface. The travelers, exhausted, slumped in their boats. They bailed out water with cupped hands, repaired torn bindings, fed the children. Their silence now carried a different quality, not reverence, but survival. Days continued. More storms came and went, sometimes 3 in a row, sometimes weeks apart. Hunger gnawed at them. Water supplies ran low. They learned to gather rain, to fish with improvised nets, to conserve every bit of energy. Elders shared quiet wisdom, how to read the swells, how to follow birds, how to sense shifts in temperature. Knowledge, not strength, kept them alive. Not every moment was hardship. Some nights carried a strange beauty. When the moon rose bright and round, the ocean glowed with its reflection, turning waves into silver mountains. The travelers watched in silence, feeling the ancient pull of something larger than themselves. Other nights, the sky erupted with stars so dense and brilliant that the sea beneath looked like a dark mirror reflecting the universe. Children reached out, trying to touch the lights. Parents smiled softly, letting them dream. Songs emerged, slow, melodic, almost whisper-like, not to celebrate, but to soothe. They were lullabies for the sea, offerings of harmony to calm its restless spirit. And sometimes, just sometimes, the waves softened as if listening. Still, the journey carved itself into their bodies. Skin burned from the sun, arms trembled from rowing, eyes reddened from wind and salt. Sleep came in fragments, and yet they continued, forward. One morning, after what felt like an eternity, something changed. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The wind carried a new scent, faint but unfamiliar, less salty, more earthly. The elders were the first to notice. They inhaled deeply, exchanged glances, and whispered the word no one dared believe at first: land. The younger ones didn't understand. They saw only water, endless, stretching out in every direction. But the elders were certain. The sea had its own language, and they had learned it well. That evening, birds appeared, small at first, then larger ones circling overhead. Birds never strayed too far from places where they could rest. This was the sign the travelers had been waiting for. The group tightened formation. Every boat drew closer. They didn't know how far the land was, but they knew it was real. For the first time in many days, excitement stirred within them, quiet, cautious, but unmistakable. By midnight, fog rolled across the water, thick and gentle. Their boats drifted slowly, guided more by instinct than sight. The fog muted all sounds, creating a dreamlike silence. And then, through the mist, the ocean changed again. The waves softened, the water grew shallower, oars scraped against something solid, sand. The long, unrecorded journey had finally ended. They didn't cheer. Their exhaustion was too deep for celebration. Instead, they sat motionless for several minutes, absorbing what the ocean was telling them. You've reached the end. Step carefully. Begin again. One by one, they lowered themselves into the water and walked onto the shore. It was night, quiet, dark, peaceful. No animals stirred, no voices echoed. The land greeted them with stillness, the same stillness that would one day form the opening of a new chapter in human history. They didn't know what this place was. They didn't know whether anyone else lived here. They didn't know if it would allow them to survive. But they had crossed the impossible. They had survived the sea. And with that survival, they earned the right to try. Their feet marked the sand, humble steps softened by exhaustion. Those footprints, erased by the tide within hours, were the only trace of a journey that would never be fully told, a journey carried by memory, shaped by endurance, and sealed in the quiet resilience of the human spirit. They had arrived, and their story, still unwritten, waited for its next chapter. Soon they would step inland, searching for water, shelter, and meaning. Soon the land would reveal itself in fragments, forest, river, stone. And soon their footsteps would form the earliest threads of a history that would echo far into the future. But for now, just for now, they rested. The endless water was finally behind them, and the land that had no name lay waiting ahead. The forest waited for them long before they ever stepped beneath its canopy, an ancient guardian watching from a distance as they arrived from the ocean's edge. When the travelers finally turned inland from the quiet shoreline, they were stepping into a world shaped by time far older than human memory. Towering trunks rose like pillars into the sky, their crowns weaving together to form a ceiling of green and gold. The air beneath the trees felt different, cooler, thicker, almost alive. Each breath they took carried the scent of moss, bark, earth, and something faintly sweet drifting from unseen flowers. For the first time since their long ocean crossing, the travelers felt sheltered. The forest did not roar, it did not threaten, it simply watched. As the group moved deeper, their footsteps softened against the ground. Fallen leaves cushioned each step, muting the sound so that even a dozen humans could pass through without disturbing the natural rhythm. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in gentle threads, illuminating tiny particles in the air that drifted like slow, wandering fireflies. Everything moved at its own pace, unhurried, deliberate, old. The travelers instinctively lowered their voices. The forest seemed to demand it. Before they had walked far, they encountered a clearing. It wasn't large, just wide enough to let the sky peek through fully. Sunlight warmed the earth in a soft circle. It felt intentional, as if time itself had carved a resting place for anyone patient enough to find it. The group paused there, letting exhaustion slip off their bodies like old skin. For the first time since stepping ashore, they felt the possibility of home. The decision to make camp did not require discussion. The clearing simply felt right. It seemed safe, defensible, close to water, and stable enough for shelter. But even more than that, it felt calm. After days and nights on the restless ocean, the quiet stability of the forest was a kind of miracle. They set down their belongings slowly, bundles of dried food, shaped stones, tools, bowstrings, pelts, everything placed with care. Before doing anything else, they listened, a habit born from survival. They listened to the wind as it traveled through the trees. They listened to the birds calling in the distance, some with voices they had never heard before. They listened to the small animals rustling through the undergrowth. None of the sounds carried danger. All of them carried life. The clearing's soil was soft and dark, rich in nutrients. Some among them knelt down, pressed their palms into the earth, and whispered words from their homeland, words of respect for new land, words asking permission to stay. Whether the land was answered was unclear, but the forest did not resist them. As afternoon settled, the travelers began building their first temporary shelters. They did not have time to construct permanent homes. These were meant to be simple. A frame of branches, tied with fiber and covered with woven mats or hides they carried from across the sea. They worked in pairs and small groups. One gathered fallen branches thick enough to support weight. Another shaped the ends with stone tools. Others collected leaves and ferns for bedding. Every task felt purposeful. Every movement felt like part of a ceremony. Children, too tired to help,
sat near the center of the clearing, watching the adults. Their eyes were wide, absorbing everything: the height of the trees, the distant sounds, the unfamiliar insects that crawled along the roots. One child held a small stone from their homeland, a reminder of where they had come from. Another traced shapes into the dirt, forming patterns mimicking the waves of the ocean they had just escaped. Even in their innocence, the children intuitively understood the importance of this place. They were witnessing the beginning of something new. By evening, the shelters stood complete, simple but sturdy. They formed a small semicircle around the campfire space, leaving room for movement and safety. When the sun began to dip, the travelers gathered wood for the fire. Some collected fallen twigs, others carried larger branches. A few found tree bark that peeled away easily, perfect for kindling. The fire came to life with gentle crackles, a dancing flame that illuminated the clearing in warm hues of orange and gold. Shadows stretched long and slow across the ground. The forest glowed faintly, as if acknowledging the presence of these newcomers. Fire, to the travelers, was not merely warmth, it was a memory. Fire meant stories, traditions, survival. Around it, they could rest, speak softly, eat, or simply be. The ocean had not given them such comfort, but the forest did. As night settled in, the sounds of the forest changed. Day creatures quieted, night creatures awoke. The travelers heard low hoots from distant birds, the soft crackling of insects, the rustle of unseen animals weaving through the brush. None of the sounds felt threatening. The forest was vast enough that danger certainly existed somewhere, but on this night it offered peace. They ate slowly: roots, dried fish from the boat, a few berries they'd confirmed as safe. Simple nourishment for weary bodies. After eating, they began mapping tasks for the coming days. They would need fresh water, reliable food sources, and a more permanent camp if this clearing proved safe. They would need to scout the area. They would need to understand the land's moods, weather patterns, and hidden pathways. The elders spoke little but observed everything. Their eyes traced the treetops, studied the animals, noted the behavior of the wind. Experience had taught them that land revealed itself slowly. A forest this ancient had stories of its own, stories held in the rings of trees, in the paths carved by animals, in the stones shaped by rivers. To survive here, they would have to listen. Night deepened. Stars shimmered through the open patch of sky above the clearing. The constellations looked unfamiliar, rearranged into patterns that meant nothing to them yet. But the sky felt calm, stable, and watchful, and that was enough. One by one, they drifted to sleep. The forest watched.
Dawn arrived with soft light filtering through the leaves. The air was cool, carrying the damp scent of morning dew. Birds called out with enthusiasm, filling the clearing with a chorus of notes. The forest awakened gently around the travelers, inviting them to do the same. They began the day by exploring without venturing too far. Their goal was simple: learn. The forest offered subtle clues. The type of moss growing on one side of the trees indicated direction. The presence of certain plants hinted at soil fertility. Fallen branches suggested recent weather. Bird activity revealed water nearby. Eventually they found it, a narrow stream flowing with clear, cold water, a precious discovery. They cupped their hands, drank slowly, washed their faces, and filled their skins. The stream became their lifeline. By midday, a group returned with new observations. They had found game trails, signs of deer-like animals. They had identified edible plants and berries. They had noticed trees with thick bark perfect for tools. The forest was beginning to speak, and the travelers were learning its language. Days passed. Their temporary shelters grew more stable.
They reinforced the structures with sturdier branches. They wove mats from forest grass. They created stone tools. They built drying racks for food. They formed a fire pit surrounded by stones. Everything remained humble, but everything worked. Their routines developed naturally. The hunters ventured carefully along the outskirts of the forest, studying prey and practicing caution. Gatherers collected berries, roots, and herbs. A few remained with the children, teaching them small tasks. Elders offered advice when needed, but spent much of their time observing the movement of nature. At night, a firelight brought them together. They spoke gently about the ocean they crossed, about the homeland they left behind, about the possibilities of this new place. They never raised their voices. Loud sounds felt out of place here. The forest deserved respect. The clearing began to feel like a sanctuary. The forest's towering walls offered protection from wind and rain. The trees filtered sunlight into soft hues. The animals, though cautious, did not seem threatened by their presence. The travelers took this as a sign. They were meant to stay, at least for now. One evening, after a successful hunt, they gathered for a small gratitude ceremony. They thanked the land for its generosity. They thanked the forest for its shelter. They thanked the animals for sustaining life. These rituals were not grand. They were quiet, sincere, and rooted in tradition. The forest responded not with words, but with serenity. As seasons shifted, the air grew cooler. Leaves changed color, turning gold, red, and brown. The forest whispered new lessons: how to insulate shelters, how to dry food for winter, how to identify animal tracks in fallen leaves. The travelers adapted. Winter arrived slowly, almost politely. The first frost was thin and delicate, decorating the edges of leaves like tiny crystals. The travelers had prepared well. Their shelters were held. Their fire burned steadily. Their food was stored carefully. The forest, though colder, remained alive. Animals moved differently, slower, more cautious. The wind sounded deeper, as if carrying stories from far beyond the trees. Snow fell lightly, coating the clearing in soft white. The travelers sat by the fire, wrapped in furs, watching flakes drift down. Children laughed quietly, trying to catch snow on their hands. Winter taught them resilience. It taught them patience. It taught them that the land could be harsh, but never cruel without reason. The forest tested them, but it also embraced them. When spring arrived, the clearing transformed again. Snow melted, streams overflowed, trees sprouted new leaves, birds returned with vibrant songs. The entire forest felt renewed, as if celebrating the travelers' survival. During this time, the travelers ventured deeper into the forest. They discovered larger streams, open meadows, and tree species they hadn't seen before. They found stones that sharpened their tools better. They identified plants useful for medicine. With each discovery, the forest felt less unknown and more like a quiet teacher. But the land was vast, far larger than they had imagined, and the travelers knew they could not stay in one place forever. The forest had nourished them, protected them, and shaped their early days. But beyond these trees, there were rivers that curved like threads across the land, valleys rich with life, and pathways carved by the natural world long before humans arrived. Eventually, the day came when they decided to move forward, not to abandon the clearing, but to expand their understanding. They would follow the water. They would trace river paths. They would let the land guide them gently into its deeper mysteries. As they packed their belongings, the forest watched quietly. No hostility, no reluctance, only an old patience that had seen countless journeys begin beneath its branches. Their shelters would remain behind, slowly reclaimed by nature. Their footsteps would fade beneath new leaves, but the memory of the forest, the safety it gave them, the lessons it offered, the peace it wrapped around their exhausted bodies, would carry forward in every step they took. The first camp beneath the ancient trees had been their beginning, and now the land invited them to move deeper, to let flowing water show the next way forward. Soon they would follow the rivers. Soon the land would stretch wider than their imagination, and soon the quiet journey would continue.
When the travelers finally stepped beyond the last familiar trees of their first forest camp, they did so with quiet reverence. The forest had been their shelter, their first teacher in the new land. But the land was vast, and something deeper called to them, something older than memory itself. That call came not from wind, nor from trees, nor from the cries of distant animals. It came from water. The stream they had found near their first camp had always seemed more than just a source of drinking water. It had a subtle pull, a directionality that felt intentional. Even when the travelers didn't understand the land's terrain, they felt the water's instinctive urge to lead. Streams had a way of connecting. Small trickles joined larger flows. Gentle currents hinted at wider rivers beyond the forest walls, and where water moved, life always followed. So they followed the water. At first, they walked beside the familiar stream, moving slowly with careful steps. The forest canopy filtered sunlight into soft green hues. Every time wind brushed the leaves, dappled light danced across the traveler's skin like gentle signals guiding them forward. The stream whispered along stones, murmuring fragments of direction. It never raised its voice, never rushed. The water flowed with the patience of something that had shaped this world long before humans ever arrived. The children walked closest to the water. They enjoyed dipping their fingers into the cool flow, watching ripples spread in perfect circles. Sometimes they dropped leaves in and followed them with laughter, the leaves drifting like miniature boats toward an unseen destination. Adults watched, smiling quietly. Even without words, everyone understood. The leaves were doing exactly what they were doing, trusting the river to show the way. As they traveled farther from their camp, the forest began to change. Trees spaced themselves differently. The canopy opened. The stream grew broader, fed by other small rivulets converging from deeper woods. The sound of flowing water grew louder, echoing off the trunks. At times, the river bent sharply, carving deep paths into soft earth. At other times, it flattened into wide, calm shallows where fish darted beneath the surface. The travelers paused often, taking in each change, learning the land's natural rhythm. The elders explained something the others already sensed. Water is a storyteller. Every curve of the river, every bend, every widening pool carried meaning. Water carved paths over thousands of years, shaping the land with purpose. It cut through rock, hugged valleys, fed forests, and nurtured animals. If one followed its course long enough, it always led somewhere important, either to new lands or to new sources of life. The travelers listened. For several days, they followed the stream until it merged with another, forming a small river. The sound deepened. The river spoke in a new voice, stronger, steadier, more confident. It wasn't aggressive. It felt like a guide with a broader perspective, ready to show them a world beyond the forest. Here the banks widened. Their footsteps left impressions on damp soil. Animal tracks crisscrossed the riverbanks. Deer, small mammals, birds, creatures they could not yet identify. The presence of so many tracks told them one thing. This river had been a lifeline long before they arrived. The group walked slowly, observing everything. The hunters examined tracks. The gatherers scanned the ground for new plants. Children collected brightly colored stones from the river's edge. The elders paused occasionally, placing their hands in the water, feeling its temperature change as the landscape shifted. Sometimes the river ran cool, fed by mountain streams. Sometimes it warmed, absorbing sunlight from shallow beds. Each change in temperature meant new geography, new terrain, new life ahead. One morning, after several restful nights camped beside the river, the travelers woke to a soft mist clinging to the water's surface. The air felt damp, heavy with anticipation. Birds called in echoing patterns. The river hummed beneath the fog, its voice blurred but steady. When the sunlight finally burned away the mist, the travelers saw something they had never seen before: a fork. The river split into two distinct paths, one bending left, narrow and winding through a dense thicket of trees, and the other stretching broader toward open terrain. The group paused. The decision mattered. A wrong direction could lead to difficulty or danger. But water rarely misled. They observed carefully. The narrow branch moved quickly, as if rushing to reach higher ground or rocky terrain. The wider branch flowed slowly, lazily, promising stability and access to open land. The elders concluded something simple yet profound. Follow the flow that feeds life, not the one that escapes into stone. So they turned toward the broader river. As they walked, the land opened gradually. The forest thinned, giving way to patches of meadow. Tall grasses brushed against their legs, swaying with the wind. Wildflowers dotted the earth with colors none of them had words for. The sun warmed their skin. The sky widened. It felt like stepping from a sheltered home into an endless horizon. The river guided them without ever demanding their trust. It simply flowed, and they followed.
As days turned into weeks, the river revealed its deeper stories. They found signs of old beaver dams, intricate structures of wood and mud, abandoned but sturdy. They discovered old bird nests high in trees overlooking the water. They saw bones of animals who had lived and died here long before their arrival. Every sign reminded them that they were walking through a land with a long, silent history. At night, they made camp beside the river. They arranged their shelters carefully, always leaving enough space for animals to pass. Fires burned softly, their reflections shimmering on the water's surface. Fire and water, two elements, one flickering with energy, the other flowing with calm, felt balanced beside each other. The travelers spoke little at night. Sleep came easily, lulled by the quiet whispers of flowing water. Sometimes those whispers changed. As they moved upriver, the sound deepened, turning into a resonant echo that hinted at larger terrain shifts ahead. Echoes meant stone. Stone meant cliffs, hills, or valleys, and soon they found them. The riverbanks rose gently. The terrain sloped. Stones appeared beneath the clear water. The river narrowed in places, then widened again. The travelers adjusted their pace, working with the land instead of against it. One afternoon, they followed a bend and discovered a breathtaking sight. The river flowed into a long stretch of shallow water filled with smooth stones, each one shaped like an ancient secret. The stones shimmered beneath sunlight, creating a mosaic of reds, grays, greens, and blues. Children ran excitedly, hopping from stone to stone. Adults began collecting stones with sharp edges for tools. The elders found larger stones perfect for shaping tools or grinding food. This place felt like a gift, an unexpected offering from the river. But the river had more to show. As they progressed, the surroundings slowly transformed again. The meadows widened, trees became sparser, the air grew warmer. The river's voice deepened, carrying hints of distant rainfall or snowmelt. They could not see the mountains, but they sensed them far upstream. The animals changed too. They began seeing tracks of larger creatures, massive hoof prints, the marks of heavy antlers scraping against bark,
deep impressions on river mud. These animals were cautious but plentiful. They came to drink at dusk and dawn, stepping lightly as though aware of the travelers observing them. The river taught the travelers patience. Every bend offered a new view. Some bends revealed long stretches of calm water reflecting clouds like mirrors. Some revealed narrow passages flanked by cliffs. Some revealed floodplains, rich with fertile soil. Others revealed forests, smaller but denser, filled with edible plants. Despite the beauty, the journey was not without challenges. The weather shifted often. Sudden rains turned the riverbank slippery. Winds howled through open terrain. Nights grew colder as they moved deeper into unfamiliar land. But the river never abandoned them. Even when storms raged, its direction remained constant. Its flow never betrayed its path. One morning, they awoke to frost on the grass. Winter was approaching. The group knew they had to find a place to settle before the cold grew too harsh. The river, which had been a teacher and guide, now felt like it was gently urging them to prepare for what lay ahead.
They followed its cues more carefully than ever. At last, they found the place. A broad riverside plateau elevated just enough to avoid floods. Trees for shelter and wood, meadows for hunting, stones for tools, clean water flowing year-round. The river curved gently around the land, embracing the area in a protective arc. It felt perfect, not as a temporary camp, but as a place to survive winter. As they set down their packs and began planning shelters, the travelers realized something profound. The river had brought them here with intention. Every whisper, every turn, every widening flow had been part of a quiet conversation between land and traveler. And now, as winter approached, the river offered safety. That night, they built a larger fire than usual. The river shimmered beside them under the moonlight. The flames warmed their faces. Children slept close to the embers. Adults stared into the water, silently thanking it for guidance. The elders spoke softly. Water brought us life. Water led us home. Water shapes our future. The river seemed to understand. Its current has softened. Its whisper slowed. Its surface glimmered as if reflecting not the moon, but the memories of the long journey. Soon winter would test them. Soon the world would grow harsher. And soon the world around them would shift in ways they could not yet imagine. But for now, beneath a sky full of stars, they rested beside the river, the silent path that had carried them deeper into the heart of a new world.
The first signs of winter drifted into their new riverside home as quietly as morning fog. A delicate shimmer of frost appeared along the tops of grasses. The breath of the air grew colder, brushing against their skin like the touch of an unseen hand. Leaves, once vibrant with autumn colors, turned brittle and thin. The travelers watched these changes with deep attention. Back in their old land, they had known winter intimately, but this new world carried a different kind of cold, one shaped by unfamiliar winds, unknown patterns, and landscapes they were only beginning to understand. The river whispered a colder song. Its voice, once fluid and melodious, now carried a deeper, more measured rhythm. When they dipped their hands into the water, it stung slightly, reminding them that warmth would soon become precious. Yet the river did not freeze, not yet. Its constant movement kept it alive, though its surface glistened with the early breath of ice. They prepared. The shelters needed reinforcement. Their first structures, woven from branches and leaves, had been perfect for mild nights, but winter demanded more. So the travelers gathered fallen timber, thick logs, sturdy branches, bark heavy with age. They layered the outer walls with woven reeds and grasses. They packed earth around the base to block the wind. They lined the interiors with furs and moss to trap heat. The shelters transformed slowly from simple coverings into protective homes. Children watched eagerly as the adults worked.
They carried smaller pieces of wood, fetched bundles of dry grass, and held fibers while the elders tied them. Learning was part of survival, and winter sharpened every lesson. Fire grew essential. They began collecting more wood than ever, forming organized piles protected from the snow that would soon arrive. Dry branches were placed under rock overhangs. Bark was stored inside shelters to ensure fire-starting materials remained usable. They learned which trees burned slowly, which gave the least smoke, which provided the most warmth. Each type of wood had its own personality, and the travelers treated them with the same respect they gave the river and forest. As the cold deepened, animals began moving differently around them. Tracks appeared in the morning frost, hoofprints, paw prints, delicate bird trails. Some creatures migrated, leaving behind only silence and faint impressions in the soil. Others grew thicker fur, preparing for what the world would soon unleash. The travelers watched their behavior carefully. Animals often sensed winter shifts long before humans did. Hunting changed too. Game grew scarce as animals conserved energy. Hunters ventured farther, moving slowly, leaving as little trace as possible. They studied the terrain, the wind's direction, and the snow's early footprints. Every successful hunt became a shared victory. A meal, yes, but also a reminder that the land still supported them. They never hunted more than they needed, and each animal was honored with quiet gratitude. The river remained their most constant companion. Even as the edges began to gather thin layers of ice, the central flow stayed open. They used it to clean tools, to fetch water, to preserve food by placing it in cold currents wrapped in woven baskets. At night, the river's voice seemed to carry through the cold air with greater clarity, like an elder sharing wisdom in a softer tone. Days shortened. Nights grew impossibly long. Darkness fell early, pressing against the edges of the camp like a heavy blanket. The travelers adjusted their routines. They rose with the sun and worked quickly, conserving daylight. In the evenings, they sat around the fire, sharing silent company. Sometimes someone told a story, not loudly, but in a hushed tone suited to the surrounding cold. Stories warmed the mind when the body could no longer fight the chill alone. The first snowfall arrived one morning without warning. It came silently, drifting from the sky in soft white flakes that melted on the travelers' faces. At first, no one spoke. They simply stood in the clearing, looking upward, watching the sky release its delicate gift. Snow settled on the branches, softened the forest floor, and transformed the land into something dreamlike. For a moment, they forgot the hardship winter brought. Snow, in that first gentle descent, held a beauty they could not deny. But beauty often carried weight. Within hours, the snowfall thickened, the wind picked up, the ground disappeared beneath a white blanket. Footsteps became slower, movement required effort. The cold seeped through layers of fur and woven reeds. Every task became more deliberate, from gathering wood to fetching water to simply walking from one shelter to another. The travelers did not despair. Winter has always been part of life. They understood that survival depended on discipline, patience, and cooperation. Inside the shelters, the fire became the heartbeat of their camp. Flames flickered against the walls, casting warm shadows that soothed tired minds. They sat close together, sharing body heat, exchanging quiet glances. No one complained. Hardship was simply another teacher, and winter was the strictest instructor of all.
Snow continued for days. Sometimes it fell lightly, creating glittering layers across the land. Sometimes it came in heavy bursts, driven sideways by relentless wind. The forest grew quieter. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, hiding in sheltered nests. Yet the travelers found beauty in the stillness. Footprints in the snow told stories. Each track revealed where animals had passed, how they moved, where they sheltered. The river, no longer whispering but humming under thin layers of ice, created patterns on the water's surface when the sunlight struck it. Trees, stripped of their leaves, stood tall and stark against the sky, like ancient guardians. Winter revealed shapes and structures invisible during warmer months. Time moved differently. The cold slowed everything: movement, thought, breath, even sound. Voices didn't carry far. Footsteps muffled beneath the snow. The world became quieter than the ocean, quieter than the forests they had crossed. In this quiet, the travelers found something unexpected. Silence had a wisdom of its own. In the stillness, their senses heightened. They learned to read the weather by the air's taste. They learned to hear distant cracks in the ice, signaling shifts in the river's strength. They learned the patterns of snowfall, the soft kind that warmed the ground, and the sharp kind that hinted at storms. Winter became their teacher in patience. On especially cold nights, when the fire struggled and the wind screamed beyond the shelter walls, the group gathered their children and elders toward the center, forming circles of warmth. The hunters and strongest adults formed the outer ring, shielding the others from drafts. They slept in shifts, ensuring the fire never died. Every spark felt precious, a tiny sun battling the vast cold. Sometimes in these long nights, soft conversations emerged. How long will winter stay? Will the river freeze completely? Will the animals return in spring? The elders answered gently, not with certainty, but with calm reassurance. Winter is not our enemy. It is a reminder. It teaches us its rhythm. We listen, we adapt, we endure. The group internalized these lessons. Instead of resisting winter, they leaned into it. They used the cold to preserve food, using snowbanks as natural storage. They crafted stronger tools using wood hardened by the freeze. They discovered that certain stones cracked more easily in the cold, making tool-making simpler. The land, even in winter, offered gifts. As weeks passed, their relationship with the cold changed. They no longer trembled when winds howled. They understood the patterns now. They could tell when a storm was approaching by the silence of animals or the sudden heaviness in the air. They recognized which trees bent dangerously in strong winds. They knew when the river's ice could hold weight and when it was a silent trap. One night, snow fell thick and fast, shaping the land into a white maze. The camp seemed smaller, held within walls of sculpted snow. Yet there was peace in that enclosure. The fire's glow reflected off the snowbanks, filling the clearing with warm, golden light. Children made small shapes in the snow, tracing designs with sticks. Adults mended tools, garments, and baskets. Elders stared into the fire, listening to the crackling wood, as though hearing ancient voices. Outside, the wind softened. The snow fell in a rhythmic pattern, like the world's slowest heartbeat. By the middle of winter, they had learned another lesson. Community mattered more than individual strength. Survival came from shared effort. When one person gathered wood, another prepared the fire. When hunters returned, their catch fed everyone. When the elders sensed danger, the group reacted as one. Winter had erased the boundaries between them, creating not just a camp, but a unified family shaped by shared struggle. Food grew scarce at times, but never vanished completely. The river, even in its frozen silence, offered fish beneath the ice. Hunters carved holes, lowering woven traps with steady hands. Snow muffled their movements, allowing them to catch animals more easily. The group thanked each animal, offering small gestures of respect.
By late season, the travelers began to sense a subtle shift. The wind felt different, still cold, but carrying less bite. The snow softened. The sun lingered a little longer on the horizon. Animals moved slightly more. Birds called faintly in the morning. These changes were small, but unmistakable. Winter was loosening its grip. But it did not leave quickly. The world seemed to hold its breath, paused between seasons. Days warmed, then chilled again. Snow melted, then returned overnight. It was a season of uncertainty, but the travelers handled it with calm acceptance. They had learned winter's language, and now its final lessons arrived in fragments. They repaired shelters for the coming melt. They reinforced storage pits. They positioned rocks to divert floodwater. Winter was ending, but spring brought its own challenges. Melting ice turned the river wild. The thawing ground became unstable. Heavy rains could reshape the land. Yet the travelers were not afraid. Winter had forged them. It had taught them that endurance was quieter than fear, stronger than wind, and subtler than snow. It had taught them to read the land not as outsiders, but as participants in its endless cycle. As the frost slowly dissolved and water trickled back into flowing paths, the travelers stepped outside their shelters and looked at the world returning to life. The river shimmered with new energy. Trees hinted at budding leaves. Birds filled the air with cautious songs. They stood together, breathing in the cool air, not harsh now, but refreshing. The land was shifting again, and they were ready to move with it. When the last breath of winter finally loosened its hold on the land, the world did not erupt into brightness all at once. Instead, it changed slowly, like a long exhale drifting through the trees. The snow that had once shaped the landscape melted in soft stages, first the edges, then the thicker layers, then the final patches clinging stubbornly to the shaded corners of the forest. What remained underneath was a land renewed, yet tired, soaked with thawing water, imprinted with the memories of a silent season. The travelers emerged from winter's enclosure with quiet wonder. Their bodies were leaner, their movements slower, but their spirits had sharpened into something resilient. Winter had not merely tested them, it had bonded them. They no longer saw themselves as separate families or individuals. The cold had woven them together into something stronger, a community. This community did not declare itself loudly. It grew in small gestures, in subtle cooperation, in shared silences around small fires. The first fire of early spring was different from the fires they had tended through winter. Its crackle sounded lighter, almost cheerful. The wood burned easily now that the air wasn't damp with icy breath. Smoke rose gracefully, drifting towards a sky no longer heavy with snow. The group gathered around it, not huddled for survival, but seated comfortably, absorbing warmth at a gentler pace. They didn't need to speak to express their gratitude. The children were the first to reclaim the world outside the shelters. Their laughter returned, not loud or chaotic, but soft, like a bird's song carried on the breeze. They ran across the clearing, splashing through puddles, picking up sticks softened by melting snow, observing insects that had remained hidden through winter. They asked curious questions, pointing at unfamiliar sprouts pushing through the earth. Adults answered with patient smiles. Life was unfolding again, and the young ones were the first to feel it. The elders walked the perimeter of the camp each morning, studying the land with wise, experienced eyes. They observed how the river swelled with meltwater, how the earth sank slightly where the frost had loosened the soil, how certain animal tracks reappeared after months of absence. Their observations guided the group's next steps.
Spring was not merely a change of season, it was a shift in momentum. The community began reorganizing itself naturally. Hunters ventured into the forests again, not with desperation, but with renewed awareness. They could move faster now that snow no longer slowed their steps. They paid attention to animal migrations, new trails revealed by thawing ground, and the early signs of plant regrowth. Their returns to camp were met not with frantic relief, but with calm appreciation. Everyone shared in the reward of their effort. Gatherers spent their days exploring areas previously inaccessible due to winter's weight. They found the first edible shoots of spring, pale, tender growths peeking through the soil. They discovered patches of wild herbs, hardy enough to survive seasonal shifts. They followed the song of insects to flowering plants, collecting nectar-rich blossoms for drinks and medicines. These discoveries brought a subtle excitement. Food was no longer only what had been stored. Mothers taught children how to identify safe plants. Fathers showed them how to shape sticks into useful tools. Elders showed them how to follow the river's voice without losing direction. Knowledge flowed freely now, no longer guarded, no longer fragmented. The group understood that survival depended on shared wisdom, and spring made sharing easier. Small fires burned around the camp each evening, not large enough to draw attention, just enough to gather around. It was around these fires that community took shape. The travelers built seating from fallen logs and smooth stones. They created small circles where families mingled instead of separating. Firelight illuminated faces that winter had hardened, now slowly softening again. Conversations drifted in quiet waves, stories whispered with nostalgia, hopes spoken with cautious optimism. Sometimes they sat in silence, simply listening to the night sounds returning after months of winter's hush. Owls called from the forest edges. Crickets tested tentative chirps in the darkness. The river murmured with a new confidence, carrying the energy of melting snow from faraway heights. Even the wind felt gentler, brushing past them with familiar warmth. Across this backdrop, a subtle social structure began forming, not through authority or rules, but through natural roles shaped by experience. The hunters began teaching others how to track animals in the soft earth. Gatherers organized seasonal knowledge, what sprouted early, what sprouted late, what to avoid, what to harvest. Toolmakers sharpened blades, shaped axes, and strengthened bows. Caretakers tended to the children, teaching them small tasks, encouraging them to imitate the rhythms of nature. The elders observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. They knew that the strongest communities weren't built on command. They were shaped through shared purpose, and purpose flowed through this camp like water through the river. As days warmed further, the community began expanding its work beyond immediate needs. They created drying racks to preserve the fish the river now offered generously. They built storage pits farther from the riverbank, preparing for unexpected changes in water flow. They reinforced shelters, not out of desperation, but out of understanding that the land's kindness could shift at any moment. They also began shaping the area into something that felt less temporary. Paths formed naturally from repeated footsteps. Stones were arranged to mark specific areas, food storage zones, tool-making spots, safe play spaces for children. Wooden stakes were placed near the riverbank to measure water levels. A wider communal fire pit emerged at the camp's center, where evening gatherings took place. None of this happened through instruction. It happened because people trusted each other. They moved as one organism, adapting to the land as it adapted to them. Certain evenings held special significance. When the sun dipped behind the tree line and the sky shifted to deep purples and blues, the community gathered around their largest fire. They sat in a wide circle, watching sparks drift upward into the night like tiny stars returning to the sky. Stories flowed more freely on these nights, stories of the homeland, stories of the ocean crossing, stories of ancestors whose names had long faded, but whose memories lived in every breath they took. Children listened wide-eyed. Adults listened with quiet reflection. Elders spoke softly, but with authority born of age. These fireside moments shaped the identity of the community, weaving their shared past into the present.
As spring matured, new challenges emerged, but none felt overwhelming. Rain sometimes came in heavy sheets, pounding the riverbank until the water rose dangerously close to some shelters. The community responded by moving certain structures uphill, reinforcing others with stone. They learned to read the clouds, the timing of birds' flights, the temperature of wind, each sign revealing the likelihood of storms. They discovered new animals, some harmless, others dangerous. They learned to coexist by observing boundaries. Wolves watched from a distance, but did not approach. Large herbivores wandered the meadows, snorting and stomping, but avoiding confrontation. Birds built nests near the river, displaying strange dances in the early morning light. Every discovery added another layer to their understanding of the land. One day, the hunters returned with news that changed the rhythm of the community. They had found signs of another group of people, faint footprints in softened earth, a broken branch purposely angled, smoke rising far beyond the river's bend. The travelers were not alone. Fear didn't grip them, curiosity did. But the elders advised patience. Winter had taught them caution. Just as animals respected each other's territories, humans should approach slowly, intentionally. So the community continued its routines, listening for more signs before making any decision. Spring's lessons were gentler, but just as important as winter's. It taught them that the land, even when generous, required balance. It taught them that fire was not merely warmth, but a symbol of unity. It taught them to observe before acting, to learn before deciding. But most importantly, spring revealed the beauty of community, the subtle ways people leaned on each other, built trust, shared labor, and celebrated small victories. As days lengthened, the river sparkled with midday light, trees blossomed with delicate flowers, the forest hummed with new energy, the land sang softly, as though acknowledging the traveler's presence. In these months of renewal, the community grew deeper roots. They had survived the ocean. They had survived the forest. They had survived winter. Now they were learning how to live, truly live, in harmony with a world that felt both strange and welcoming. And as the sun set on another calm evening, small fires flickered across the camp, glowing like scattered stars resting on the earth. People sat beside them, speaking quietly, laughing softly, leaning on one another without hesitation. The community, once fragile, was now whole, and the land around them breathed in rhythm with their quiet lives.
The river valley had grown familiar by the time the first signs appeared, signs that the travelers were no longer the only ones moving through this land. It began quietly, almost gently, like the earliest hints of spring that had arrived weeks earlier. A twig broken in an unnatural way, footprints pressed into soft earth, not made by animal hooves or paws. A faint whiff of smoke on a still morning, drifting from somewhere beyond the river's bend. The travelers noticed these signs one by one, unsure what to think at first. The forest had always been full of mysteries, but these traces carried a shape and rhythm too deliberate to belong to the wild. A hand had broken that twig. A foot had shaped that print. A mind had tended that fire. And so, without saying it aloud, the community felt something shift in the air, an awareness, a tension, a sense of being observed. Spring sunlight washed softly through the trees, casting long shadows along the riverbank. Children played near the shallows, skipping stones across the water. Adults worked around the camp, sharpening tools, cleaning hides, preparing baskets for gathering. But occasionally, their eyes drifted toward the forest, scanning the edges where sunlight faded into shadow. They did not panic, they simply knew. The elders felt it most deeply. Their instincts, shaped by years of reading the land and studying the subtleties of nature's language, told them something simple. Someone was near. Not an animal, not a predator, something far more complicated. The river, sensing the tension, seemed to change its tone. Its voice grew softer, more cautious, as if urging them to pay attention. The wind changed direction often. Birds perched on lower branches, watching silently. Even the forest seemed to breathe differently, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. Then, one morning, before the sun had fully risen, the hunters returned with news that shaped the entire community's thoughts. They had seen movement. Not clearly, not enough to define shape or intention, but they had seen a figure slipping between the trees, swift, deliberate, alert. Dark hair, upright posture, clothing made from hides or woven fibers, someone watching them from a distance. A quiet hush fell over the camp. Not fear, not excitement, just awareness. The travelers gathered near the riverbank where the morning mist drifted in low, shifting layers. No one raised their voice, no one rushed. They simply stood together, sharing the calm that had grown naturally among them through winter's trials. The presence of another people, if indeed that was what they had sensed, was not something to take lightly, but neither was it something to fear blindly. The elders spoke first, their voices low and steady. Land this vast seldom belongs to one group alone. Others walk it, others live with it, others follow its rivers and forests. We must understand before we act. Understanding, however, required patience. The community resumed its routines, but every task now carried a second layer of awareness. When gatherers left to search for berries or herbs, they walked in pairs instead of alone. When hunters tracked game through the trees, they moved more slowly, listening for unfamiliar footsteps. Even the children stayed closer to the camp, sensing the subtle shift in the air. Days passed. The signs became clearer. Footprints appeared closer to the river, parallel to their own, but not overlapping. Small woven objects were found near the forest edge, bundles of dried grass, a shaped stone, a feather tied with thin fiber. None were threatening. If anything, they felt like messages, signals, perhaps even gestures of curiosity. Still, caution outweighed curiosity.
One evening, as the sun set behind distant hills, the travelers gathered around the largest fire. Its glow flickered across their faces, warming them after a long day of quiet alertness. Smoke curled upward, disappearing into the soft blue of twilight. The group sat in thoughtful silence. Then came the moment none of them expected. A sound. A single, hesitant sound. A crack of a branch beneath a careful footstep coming from beyond the glow of the firelight. Every head turned toward the forest edge. The trees stood tall and dark, their trunks forming pillars of shadow. The river continued whispering softly nearby. No one moved. Another sound followed, a light rustle. The hunters exchanged glances, hands drifting instinctively toward their tools. Parents pulled children closer. The elders lifted their chins, eyes narrowing with steady focus. Then, as if responding to the unspoken tension, a figure appeared at the edge of the fire's reach. At first, they saw only a silhouette, tall, lithe, cautious. The firelight barely touched the figure, but enough to reveal a human shape wrapped in hide and fur. The person did not step closer. They stood still, waiting. The community did not panic. Instead, one of the elders, an aged woman whose voice held the weight of memory, slowly raised her open hand, a gesture of peace, a gesture older than language, a gesture that said, "We see you." The figure hesitated. Then, mirroring the motion, they raised their own hand. A breath seemed to pass through the entire clearing. Not a sigh, not relief, but the quiet acknowledgement of something profound. Two worlds meeting for the first time. The figure stepped forward into a better light. They were young, perhaps not yet grown, but old enough to carry purpose.
Their hair was tied back with thin strips of woven fiber. Their clothing was stitched with refined skill. Their eyes were watchful but not aggressive. They took one more step, then stopped again. The space between them and the travelers held the weight of countless possibilities. The elder spoke softly, using simple words, slow gestures, and a calm tone. The young stranger tilted their head, listening. They responded with their own sounds, soft, rhythmic, unfamiliar, a language shaped by another lineage. The two did not understand each other's words, but they understood the tone. They understood the intention. Friendship began not with conversation, but with presence. After several moments, the stranger lowered their gaze respectfully, then reached into a small woven pouch at their side. They pulled out a handful of dried berries, carefully chosen, clearly safe, perhaps even precious, and extended their hand toward the travelers. A gift. Silence blanketed the camp. Firelight shimmered across the outstretched offering. The community watched, breath held in collective anticipation. The elder walked forward slowly, not hurried, not fearful. Her steps were deliberate, measured, as if acknowledging the sacredness of the moment. She accepted the berries, bowed her head slightly, and offered a small stone figurine in return, crafted by children earlier that day. The exchange was complete. A bridge had formed. The stranger took one step backward, as if signaling the end of this first meeting. They placed their hand on their chest, nodded once, and then disappeared quietly into the forest.
The camp exhaled. This was the first friendship. But friendship carried shadows, too. In the days that followed, more signs appeared, some familiar, others unsettling. Tracks of multiple people appeared in the mud. Movement in the trees became more frequent. Sometimes they glimpsed figures watching from afar. Sometimes they sensed presence without seeing anything. The community remained calm, but tension deepened. Who were these people? What did they want? Were there many? Were they preparing to approach or to defend? Fear did not rise in sudden explosions. It grew slowly, like cold spreading through water. The travelers felt it in small ways, hunters pausing longer before stepping into certain parts of the forest, gatherers glancing over their shoulders, sleepers waking more easily at night. The elders convened quietly near the river, discussing the balance between openness and caution. Their minds were steady, their voices low. They agreed on something important. Friendship was possible, but they needed to understand the land's people more deeply before extending trust beyond simple gestures. One afternoon, while the sun filtered through leaves in golden shafts, two hunters encountered something that shifted the balance once more. A clearing filled with unfamiliar structures, not huts, not shelters, something different. Woven frames, storage racks, tools laid neatly in patterns, animal pelts stretched for drying. A settlement, not large, but organized with intention. Signs of a community with its own traditions, its own rituals, its own past. The hunters did not approach. They observed from behind trees, bodies still, breaths controlled. They watched people moving, men sharpening tools, women weeding fibers, children playing near a small fire. None looked toward the forest. They were not expecting strangers. The hunters returned and shared what they had seen. The community listened with wide eyes, curious minds, beating hearts. Another world existed, not far from their own. The river valley was not empty. The forest was not uninhabited. The land held more stories than they had imagined. Evening arrived, painting the sky in deep amber hues. The travelers sat by their fires, contemplating everything they had learned. The children sensed something important unfolding. Adults spoke in gentle tones.
Elders gazed into the flames, weighing every possibility. Fear and friendship lived side by side now, two forces intertwined, each shaping the other. Neither dominated, both guided them. The land around them breathed with quiet intensity. The fire crackled softly. The river hummed its steady song. The forest watched with ageless patience. And slowly, the travelers began to understand. Meeting others in this vast new world was not something to avoid. It was something to navigate, carefully, respectfully, attentively. Friendship could open paths. Fear could reveal caution. Together, they shaped survival. The night deepened. Stars shimmered overhead, and beneath their glow, the travelers rested, knowing the world was larger than they had believed, richer in stories, fuller in possibilities. The land was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a world filled with connections they had only begun to discover. The land had begun revealing itself in ways the travelers could not have imagined in their earliest days. What had once been a mysterious wilderness was now a familiar tapestry of voices, each corner whispering something different. The river carried its ancient rhythm. The meadows swayed with soft breath. The forest stood as a living archive of seasons. But among all these shifting elements, something new began emerging, something that belonged neither to nature nor to the travelers alone. It came from stone. At first, they noticed stones shaped strangely by time. Smooth surfaces, flat like tablets, edges worn down not by water alone, but by deliberate touch. Some stones bore faint lines, curves, markings that didn't look accidental. Nature could carve intricate patterns, yes, but the travelers had learned to read the difference between the randomness of the earth and the intention of human hands. The first time they found such a stone, it lay half buried near a bend of the river where the water slowed into a calm pool. Children had been playing there, skipping pebbles and tracing circles in the mud. One child reached down and pulled out the smooth, palm-sized rock. Its surface bore a series of straight lines, intersecting at gentle angles, forming a pattern that seemed too rhythmic to belong solely to nature. The child carried it back to camp with the same excitement used to present a rare treasure. When the adults examined it, silence fell, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition of craft, of meaning, of memory shaped by human intention. Elders traced the markings with their fingertips. Hunters tilted the stone toward the fire, watching shadows deepen the etched lines. Every person felt the weight of the object, light though it was. It wasn't just a stone. It was a message from someone they hadn't yet met. Instead of discarding it, they placed the stone in the center of the communal fire circle, treating it with the same respect they gave sacred objects from their old homeland. The stone remained there for days, reminding them that the land held stories far older and deeper than their own arrival. But that stone was only the beginning.
As days passed, more signs emerged. Near the forest's edge, a gatherer found a long, flat slab nearly hidden beneath a growth of moss. When she brushed aside the greenery, she discovered symbols carved more boldly, spirals, branching lines, clusters of repeated shapes. The slab was too heavy to move, so the group gathered around it, studying the markings with quiet awe. Elders debated whether the carvings represented animals, seasons, paths, or rituals. Children touched the cold stone, fascinated by the grooves carved into its surface. Another day, hunters exploring a ridge found stones arranged in deliberate stacks, 3 stones balanced atop a larger one, facing the rising sun. The structure was ancient, moss crawling up its sides, yet the formation remained intact. The placement suggested purpose, perhaps a marker, perhaps a memorial, perhaps a signpost. Each discovery deepened the travelers' understanding. They were not the first to walk this land. Others had lived here long before them. Others had shaped stone with intention. Others had carved their thoughts into the earth so that time itself would remember. These stones did not speak in words, but in patterns, patterns that invited contemplation. In the quiet moments of dusk, when the fire glowed warmly and the sky turned dark blue, the community would pass around the smaller carved stones they had found. Each person held them gently, as if listening to the silent stories. Some believed the symbols represented maps of the land, river routes, mountain shapes, forest paths. Others felt they were records of important events, floods, hunts, seasonal changes. A few thought they were spiritual symbols meant to honor the earth, sky, and water. The truth remained unknown, and the mystery made the stones even more sacred. One afternoon, after a long hunt, a group returned with news of something more significant. While tracking an animal through the deeper forest, they had stumbled upon a cliff face rising abruptly from the earth. The cliff seemed unremarkable at first, gray stone, streaked with minerals, weathered by countless seasons. But as the hunters drew closer, they saw it. Carvings, dozens of them, stretching across the entire lower portion of the cliff. Some symbols resembled the ones they had found on individual stones, but others were more elaborate, curved lines forming shapes that suggested animals, people, or perhaps spirits. The carvings varied in depth, some shallow and worn, others sharp and fresh, as though carved only seasons ago. Time had layered itself onto the cliff in strokes of human intention. The hunters brought the community to see it.
As the group approached, they moved with deep reverence. The cliff felt like a gateway to something ancient. They placed their hands on the cool stone, feeling the grooves that had been carved with tools not unlike their own. Children stared at the symbols with wide-eyed fascination. Elders stood silently, recognizing that these carvings represented a lineage far older and deeper than their journey. The cliff told a story, one they could not fully read, but one they could feel. Some carvings depicted animals, long-horned beasts, birds with outstretched wings, fish swimming in swirling patterns. Others showed groups of people standing together, arms intertwined or raised toward the sky. Some symbols resembled stars, moons, and suns, arranged in unfamiliar patterns. There were scenes of movement, scenes of stillness, scenes of ritual, all carved into stone with deliberate patience. The travelers did not claim these carvings. They did not try to alter them or interpret them with certainty. They understood that these were memories of other people, people connected to the land in ways they were only beginning to understand. Instead, they learned from them quietly. Elders noticed that certain symbols repeated in specific patterns, suggesting a language or tradition. Hunters observed that animal carvings corresponded to paths and territories they had already discovered. Gatherers recognized plants depicted in sun etchings and used the information to identify new places for harvesting. The carvings became a silent guide, not a map, not a prophecy, but a testament. The land spoke through stone, and the travelers learned to listen. As the days lengthened and warmth returned fully to the valley, the community began integrating these ancient markings into their understanding of the world. They created their own small stones, not to imitate the older ones, but to express their own presence. Children pressed markings into soft clay before baking it near the fire. Adults carved simple lines into river stones to represent their families or memories from the winter. These were not grand works, they were seeds of their own tradition. One evening, after a day spent gathering herbs near the forest's edge, a group of women found an unusual stone circle. It was small, perhaps meant for rituals or gatherings, but perfectly shaped. In the center sat a flat stone platform. On top of that lay a single carved stone showing a long, wavy line with dots scattered around it. Elders later recognized the pattern. It resembled the river and the small tributaries feeding into it. It was a story of water, a story of life.
The community began visiting this circle often, treating it as a place of reflection. They did not disturb it. They sat around it quietly, letting the land's old memories mingle with their present thoughts. In time, this circle became a place where worries softened, where decisions gained clarity, where conflicts eased without words. The stones were shaping them, just as the river had shaped their journey. But not all memories etched into stone were comforting. Further downstream, near a narrower section of the river, hunters discovered a cluster of stones marked with deeply carved grooves that spiraled inward like tightening storms. The markings felt different, sharper, more urgent, carved with force rather than patience. When the community visited the site, a hush settled over them. The stone's surface carried a heaviness, as if it held a memory of hardship, perhaps of famine, perhaps of conflict, perhaps of something lost. The elders studied it silently, then stepped back with respect, reminding the group that not every story etched into the land was meant to be unraveled immediately. Stone carried the memory honestly, both joyful and painful. As the weeks passed, the travelers continued discovering markings, some solitary, some clustered, some fresh, some ancient. Every new carving added depth to their understanding of the world they now inhabited. The land was not silent. It had been spoken long before they arrived. Only now did they have the ears to hear. Through all this, the community grew closer, not through survival alone, but through shared reflection. They often sat around small fires in the evening, turning stones over in their hands, discussing what the symbols might mean. Children created stories inspired by the carvings. Adults interpreted them through practical knowledge. Elders blended memory with intuition. The fires burned softly, casting long shadows across the stones. The river whispered nearby. The forest swayed with gentle night breezes. And in those moments, it felt as if the entire land leaned in to listen. The community began to understand something profound. Stories did not belong to one person alone. Stories belonged to the land, and the land carried them in stone, water, and memory. The travelers were not erasing the past. They were becoming part of it, slowly, gently, respectfully. Each day they walked among symbols left by hands long gone, and each day they added new moments to the land's tapestry, not carved in stone, but woven into the rhythms of daily life. Their own memories blended with the ancient ones. Their footsteps overlapped with older paths. Their fires glowed beside forgotten hearths, and the land held it all, quietly, patiently, eternally. The land had already begun shaping the settlers long before they realized just how deeply its seasons would carve patterns into their lives. Each season carried its own rhythm, its own voice, and gradually those voices seeped into their bones, into their habits, into the quiet spaces between their thoughts. Time moved forward, yes, but it was the seasons that transformed them. Each cycle of warmth and cold, growth and retreat taught lessons no elder could ever fully prepare them for. The year began to open gently after their encounters with the ancient stones. Spring had already wrapped the valley in new colors, painting soft greens across the earth and silvery ripples across the river. The settlers felt the world stretching awake, as though the land itself had been holding its breath through winter and now exhaled softly. The trees released buds in slow bursts. Early flowers opened with shy faces. Birds called from high branches, weaving songs that stitched themselves into the settlers' daily routines. Spring gave them energy. Their steps grew lighter. Their laughter rose more freely. Tasks they had approached with caution during winter were now completed with ease. The land helped them. The warm breeze dried clothes faster.
Clear weather revealed new routes, and the river offered steady water without the threat of ice. Children explored wider areas, hopping across stones, following insects and birds with curious fascination. Adults built better tools, repaired winter damage, and prepared for the next series of challenges the land would offer. In these weeks, the settlers learned to appreciate the delicate balance of spring. It was not a season of abundance, but of beginnings. Shoots emerged slowly. Berries needed time to ripen. The soil, softened by meltwater, had to recover before offering anything new. Yet even this slow promise soothed them. Spring taught patience in a different tone than winter had, less harsh, more hopeful. But spring did not linger. As the sun climbed higher each day and the air grew thicker with heat, summer arrived with a force none of them expected. Summer was not gentle like spring. It pressed itself onto the land. Long days stretched into warm evenings. Heat shimmered across the river's surface, warping reflections. Grass grew tall and dense, brushing against the settlers' legs as they moved through the meadows. The forest deepened in lushness, branches heavy with leaves that created pockets of cool shade. But summer also carried challenges that reshaped the settlers more deeply than winter ever had. The first challenge was the heat. It bore down on them relentlessly. Their shelters, built strong for winter, trapped warmth during the hottest days. The settlers adapted by opening roof sections during noon hours and resting in shaded corners of the forest. Work shifted to mornings and late afternoons. Midday became a time for stillness, quiet contemplation, weaving, tool-making, soft conversations. The river became a refuge. Settlers waded into its cool waters to wash away sweat and soothe aching muscles. Children splashed and played in the shallows, their laughter drifting over the shimmering surface. Yet even in its intensity, the heat taught resilience. It taught them to conserve energy. It taught them to understand their body's limits. It taught them to value water as more than just a necessity. Water became life, comfort, renewal.
The second challenge came from insects. As warmth enveloped the valley, insects emerged in swarms, buzzing, crawling, flickering through the air in erratic trails. They weren't merely nuisances. Some carried stings, others bit sharply. The settlers learned to burn herbs near sleeping areas, creating gentle smoke that kept most insects away. They covered themselves with thin layers of woven grasses or soft hides to protect exposed skin. Over time, they learned which plants offered relief, which leaves soothed irritation, which roots could create simple balms. The land taught healing. But the most significant challenge of summer was hunger. Not immediate hunger, but the need to prepare for seasons that would bring scarcity. Summer offered fruits, fresh herbs, edible leaves, abundant fish, and frequent game. It was tempting to consume everything as it came, yet the elders reminded them of winter's lean days and spring's fragile beginnings. So the community worked tirelessly to gather and preserve. Fish were smoked over small fires. Berries were dried on woven mats under the sun. Meat was cured with salt gathered from distant earth pockets. Nuts were cracked, sorted, stored in clay-lined pits. The work was tiring, repetitive, endless, but crucial. Summer taught foresight. The land was generous, but also honest. It offered abundance, but whispered reminders that nothing remained the same forever. When storms came, they arrived with thunderous force. Dark clouds swept across the sky, casting shadows over the valley. Wind bent trees until branches swayed like slow-moving beasts. Rain fell in sheets, pounding the earth, sending water rushing through the river at alarming speed. The settlers learned to brace their shelters, secure tools, protect their stored food. They huddled together during the worst storms, listening to the deep rumble of thunder echoing across the hills. But after each storm, a strange calm followed. The air carried the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. Small animals emerged from hiding. Birds sang brighter songs. Grass glistened with droplets that sparkled under sunlight. Summer taught renewal, violent, immediate, but cleansing.
When the heat finally softened and the wind shifted direction, something changed in the valley. Leaves turned deeper shades of green. Shadows lengthened subtly. Nights grew cooler, and mornings carried a faint chill. Autumn arrived slowly, as though hesitant to replace the fullness of summer's heat. The settlers welcomed it. Autumn felt like relief, an exhale after months of tension. Colors emerged across the land in warm tones, yellows, reds, oranges. Trees shed their leaves in soft cascades. The ground became a mosaic of color underfoot. The river slowed. The air grew crisp. The valley took on a peaceful glow that wrapped itself around the settlers with gentle familiarity. Autumn brought clarity. The elders gathered the community one evening near the fire and spoke about the importance of transition. They explained that autumn was neither a time of beginning nor ending, but of preparation, an in-between season that asked them to reflect, organize, and anticipate. So the settlers reviewed their storage pits. They reinforced their shelters again, sealing gaps that had opened during summer's expansion. They collected fallen branches for firewood. They noted animal patterns shifting, some creatures fattening for winter, others migrating. Autumn taught awareness. It also taught gratitude. This was the season when the community felt most connected, not out of necessity, but out of choice. The cooler evenings invited long gatherings around the fire. Stories flowed like water, tales of ancestors, memories of the ocean crossing, interpretations of the ancient stones, hopes for the coming years. The fire crackled softly, sparks drifted upward, the river hummed its steady melody nearby. Children collected leaves and pressed them under stones, creating patterns they gifted to adults. People crafted baskets, clothed infants in new furs, shaped tools with patient rhythms. The land felt generous again, but in quieter ways than summer. Autumn taught humility. It whispered a single truth. Everything changes, but change can be kind.
Then, gradually, the valley began to cool further. Frost returned in thin layers, tracing delicate patterns on leaves and stones. The river's voice grew deeper. The wind carried a sharper edge. Animals moved with more urgency. Winter was returning. But this winter felt different from the harsh, unknown cold they had first endured. They were no longer strangers to the land. They knew its moods, its secrets, its warnings. And the land knew them, having watched them adapt, survive, and grow. Winter returned with a sense of familiarity. Snow fell lightly at first, coating the ground in soft white. The community moved with calm confidence. Shelters were ready, food was prepared, tools were winter-crafted. Children wrapped themselves in warm furs and played in the snow, while adults exchanged amused glances. Winter taught wisdom. But even in its familiarity, winter held challenges. Snowstorms occasionally blocked paths. Food had to be rationed carefully. Cold tested endurance. Long nights required patience. Yet the settlers no longer faced winter with fear. They faced it with understanding. They knew when the river's ice was safe. They knew how to warm shelters without smoke suffocating them. They knew how to coax fire from damp wood. They knew which sounds in the night signaled danger and which signaled nothing at all. Winter shaped them quietly, molding their spirits like frost pressing against stone. By the end of the winter season, the settlers realized something profound. It wasn't simply time that had changed them. It wasn't simply the journey or the encounters or the new land. It was the seasons themselves. Spring had given them hope.
Summer had given them strength. Autumn had given them reflection. Winter had given them resilience. The land shaped their bodies, their habits, their instincts, but the seasons shaped their identity. When the first signs of thaw appeared, snow melting at the river's edges, birds returning with brighter songs, the settlers stepped outside their shelters and felt it deeply. They were no longer newcomers. They were part of this land, not through conquest, not through claims, but through adaptation, through respect, through quiet endurance. The land had changed them more than time could ever have done alone, and as they stood in the early light of another spring, breathing in the cold air softening into warmth, they understood something quietly transformative. They were not merely surviving the seasons were becoming part of them. The cycle would begin again, and they were ready to move with it, as naturally as the river flowed through the valley.
The land had taught them many lessons: how to read the river, how to endure winter, how to trust the warmth of spring, and how to gather strength from summer's abundance. But there came a time when the land taught a lesson unlike any other. It did not arrive through storms or hunger or cold. It came through something far quieter, something that slipped into their lives slowly until they realized it had become part of their every movement. Silence. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of fear, a different silence, one shaped by the rhythms of survival itself. It began on a morning when the mist clung low across the valley, turning every tree, every stone, every blade of grass into a soft silhouette against pale light. The community had woken early, preparing for a day of gathering and tool-making. Children whispered instead of laughing. Adults moved gently, as though the air itself requested quiet. At first, the settlers assumed it was instinct, a quiet morning, a peaceful mood, nothing more. But as they stepped toward the river, they sensed something unusual. The land was listening. Birds perched silently on branches, their wings tucked close. The river, usually humming with its gentle tones, seemed to move with dampened sound, as though cautious not to disturb the stillness. Even the wind blew in muted brushes, barely rustling the leaves overhead. It was as if the entire valley had paused. And the settlers, attuned to the land's subtle language, paused with it. They moved about their tasks with deliberate quiet, gathering herbs, sharpening tools, cleaning hides near the riverbank. The silence was not heavy, it was spacious, like a vast room where every sound had room to breathe. Instead of feeling pressured to speak, they felt comfort in being still. By midday, the mist had thinned, revealing the full stretch of the valley, but the sense of quiet did not leave. The elders noticed it first, the unusual calm of animals in the distance, the absence of predators' calls, the steady stillness of the river's surface. Something felt different. The community gathered near the river in small groups, speaking softly. They wondered if another group of people was nearby, if the land sensed something approaching, if a change in weather was building. But the sky showed no warning, the wind carried no threat, and the river flowed steadily. So they listened. As the sun climbed higher, the silence shifted. It became not just an absence of noise, but a presence of awareness. Every footstep on soil felt louder. Every crack of a twig carried meaning. The settlers began moving with more deliberation, stepping carefully, breathing softly. Their senses sharpened in the quiet. Sounds traveled farther. Signals from animals became clearer. Subtle shifts in the leaves revealed more information than before. This heightened awareness helped them notice something they would have missed on an ordinary day. A set of footprints on the far side of the riverbank.
Not from their community, not from any creature they knew. Human footprints, fresh, distinct, leading from the forest to the river. The travelers felt a pulse of recognition. This land was shared. Others moved through it, perhaps friends, perhaps watchers, perhaps neither. The discovery did not frighten them. Instead, it deepened their quiet. Silence became a way of acknowledging that another presence walked these paths. Speaking loudly would carry through the trees. Echoes would travel across water. So they adjusted without discussion. Silence became a form of respect.
Hunters began moving in near complete quiet, their steps feather-light, their breath controlled. Gatherers communicated through hand signals instead of words. Children learned to listen for cues in the rustle of leaves, the direction of birds' flight, the patterns of insects. Elders taught them that silence allowed the land to speak more clearly than any human voice. In days that followed, the settlers moved through the valley as if part of the natural world, blending rather than disrupting. Animals began behaving differently around them. Deer approached closer. Birds remained on branches even as people passed. The river reflected their shapes with clarity, as though recognizing them as inhabitants rather than strangers. Silence had become a bridge between them and the world around them. Yet silence offered more than connection. It offered protection. One afternoon, when the sun cast long golden rays across the forest floor, a faint tremor of movement traveled through the trees. A group of hunters noticed it first. They froze instinctively, blending into the shadows, listening. The silence allowed them to pick up distant sounds, a pattern of steps too heavy to be from their own group, too rhythmic to be from animals. They waited. A small herd of unfamiliar creatures emerged, larger than deer, with thick fur and curved horns. They moved cautiously, sniffing the air. Their presence could have startled a noisy group, leading to danger or lost opportunity. But the settlers stood still, silent, letting the creatures pass peacefully. No hunt was attempted. Observation was enough. The land was approved. Another time, during a foggy dusk, children wandering near the river almost approached the water's edge too quickly. But the silence allowed them to hear the faint crack of ice beneath thin layers left from winter, danger masked by stillness. They stepped back without needing to be told. Their instinct for quiet had attuned them to subtle warnings. Silence became their guard. As weeks turned into months, this way of living shaped their bodies and minds. They learned to communicate with subtle gestures, shared glances, soft taps on the arm. They developed a rhythm of movement that mirrored the land's own rhythm, slow when the world rested, faster when the world stirred. Their conversations became quieter, too, not absent, but thoughtful. Words were used sparingly, filled with intention. Silence became the space between thoughts, the pause that allowed them to understand each other better. Even during gatherings around the fire, where stories were often shared, silence wrapped the moments gently. People spoke in soft tones, letting the flames carry their words. Laughter emerged in subdued waves. Music, simple hums, wooden flutes, rhythm tapped on stone, flowed softly into the night air without disturbing its calm. The land welcomed this harmony. But silence was not only for comfort or respect. It became essential when uncertainty grew. One evening, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, the community felt a shift again, subtle but unmistakable. Birds flew lower, circling nervously. Small animals retreated to burrows. The wind slowed until the air felt heavy and still.
The elders instructed the community to move quietly into the densest part of the trees. They did not run, they did not shout. They moved in near total silence, relying on instincts shaped by the land itself. Minutes later, the reason became clear. A massive animal, larger than anything they had yet encountered, emerged from the deeper valley. A creature with thick fur, enormous paws, and a slow, searching gait. It sniffed the air, moving with the heavy confidence of something that feared nothing. The settlers watched from behind trees, their breath controlled, their bodies still. The creature passed. Had the settlers shouted or run, panic could have drawn the beast toward them, but silence protected them again, preserving their place in the valley's delicate balance. Over time, silence blended so thoroughly into their lives that it no longer felt like a restraint. It felt like a language, one they shared not only with each other, but with the land itself. Silence told them when to move, when to rest, when to watch, when to wait. It revealed trails previously unseen. It exposed dangers before they arrived. It invited creatures to treat them with curiosity instead of fear. It shaped their community in ways that words never could. The children who grew up in this quiet world became especially skilled at reading the land. They noticed the faintest shifts, changes in the scent of the wind, subtle differences in bird calls, the way river ripples changed shape under certain conditions. They could track animals without sound, gather without disturbing plants, sense others' presence without needing to see them. Silence made them part of the land's fabric. Even friendships with neighboring groups, those whose first signs the settlers had discovered earlier, began to grow through silence. Exchanges of offerings happened without words. Mutual respect developed through careful observation. Territory was navigated through shared understanding of unspoken boundaries. Silence dissolved fear, replacing it with awareness, and awareness brought peace. As seasons continued their endless cycle, spring unfolding into summer, summer fading into autumn, winter returning with quiet breath, the settlers lived in harmony with the valley, shaped by its beauty, its dangers, its patterns. The fires crackle, the rivers whisper, the winds sigh. These became their soundtrack. Their own voices blended into these sounds, softly, gently, naturally. They did not forget how to speak. They simply learned when speaking was necessary and when silence spoke more clearly than words. In time, people who had once been wanderers became guardians of a quiet way of life. Their days were shaped by listening, observing, moving in rhythm with the world around them. Silence had become their strength, their wisdom, their survival. And although they never declared it, everyone understood it deeply. Silence wasn't the absence of life, it was the language of the land, and they had finally learned to speak it. The land had changed them. The seasons had shaped them. Silence had taught them how to move like part of the world, rather than visitors passing through it. Now the valley they once feared had become home, not through ownership, but through belonging. Yet belonging brought with it a curious sensation, a gentle tug, a whisper from distant hills, a question carried by wind. What lay beyond the horizon? The settlers did not decide to explore all at once. The idea grew like new sprouts rising through spring soil, slow, almost unnoticed at first. Children wandered farther as their confidence grew. Hunters returned with stories of distant meadows. Gatherers found routes leading to new clusters of herbs, unfamiliar scents drifting from unseen groves. And the river, always whispering, hinted at paths stretching deeper into the land. It began on a cool morning before sunrise. Mist rose from the river, swirling in pale ribbons that curled around bare branches and drifted across the clearing. A group of hunters stood quietly near the water's edge, preparing to track herds they knew were moving beyond familiar areas. But something caught their attention, a pattern in the mud on the opposite bank. Footprints, not an animal, humans, and not belonging to their own community. The settlers stared silently at the prints. They were fresh, deliberate, spaced in a way that suggested confidence, not caution. A small group had passed through recently, heading westward toward hills none of the settlers had yet climbed. The discovery didn't alarm them, it deepened their curiosity. For months they had known others lived nearby. They had exchanged small gestures, shared distant sightings, and felt the presence of life beyond their firelight. But they had never followed the paths that led into the deeper world. That morning, as the sun began to color the sky with soft pink and gold, a quiet understanding spread through the camp. It was time to see what lay beyond their known valley. The decision was not made. It formed naturally as the land's next lesson. A group of 7 prepared for the journey, 4 hunters, 2 gatherers, and 1 elder whose knowledge of signs, skies, and winds made her presence essential. They carried simple tools, woven bags of dried food, water skins, and small offerings in case they met other groups. Their community watched them leave with calm acceptance. No fear, only silent support. They followed the river at first. Its steady flow acted as a trusted guide, curving gently through familiar terrain before tugging them westward. Each step felt both new and natural. Birds circled overhead, curious but unalarmed. Trees thinned gradually until meadows opened like blankets laid gently across the earth. The group walked for hours with slow, measured steps. They didn't rush, they observed. They noticed how the soil changed from soft river mud to firmer ground flecked with tiny stones. They felt subtle shifts in wind, warmer as they moved away from the water, cooler when they approached shadowed groves. They saw tracks belonging to creatures they had never encountered before, hoofprints larger than deer, claw marks etched into old fallen trunks, patterns of movement suggesting migrations toward distant mountains. The land was telling its stories. They simply listened.
By midday, they reached a gentle rise, a hill covered with tall grass that swayed like waves. From the top, they saw the valley they had left shrinking behind them, wrapped in mist and memories. Ahead, a vast expanse opened. Rolling hills, winding streams, clusters of trees gathered like families, and a distant line of mountains stretched like ancient guardians across the horizon. The elder closed her eyes, feeling the wind. The hunters scanned the landscape. The gatherers knelt to study unfamiliar plants growing along the hillside, broad leaves, pale blossoms, hints of medicinal scent. Everything felt untouched, yet alive. They continued. As the sun arched overhead, they reached a grove unlike any they had seen before. Tall trees with smooth bark rose in tight clusters. Their leaves formed layered canopies that filtered sunlight into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. The grove hummed with life. Small insects gliding between leaves, birds dipping in and out of branches, the distant sound of water trickling from an unseen stream. Near the grove's center, they found signs of human presence. Fresh ashes from a small controlled fire, a wooden tool left intentionally beside a stone, and markings on a tree that resembled symbols they had seen etched in stone near their home valley. They touched nothing. They simply acknowledged that they were walking within a shared world. They followed the markings deeper into the grove until the trees opened into another meadow, this one broader, more exposed to sunlight. Here they paused. The land was shifting again,
Grass grew higher. The air carried warmth even as afternoon cooled. The sky felt wider. Hills curved like sleeping animals beneath soft shadows. They walked across the meadow, feeling the softness of the ground beneath their feet, noting how the wind changed pitch as it brushed through tall grass. Then, as they approached the far side, they saw movement. Not animals, people. At first, only 3 figures, standing near a fallen tree, gathering branches, speaking in low tones. Their clothing was made of finely woven fibers, their hair tied back with strips of bark, their posture calm and grounded. The travelers stopped quietly, not hidden, simply present. The land had taught them that silence was not secrecy, it was respect. One of the figures glanced up, then another, and soon all 3 turned toward the travelers. A stillness settled over the meadow, soft, expectant. The elder stepped forward, raising her open hand, the gesture of peace she had used before. The other group examined the gesture, then returned it, mirroring it with slow, deliberate movement. The travelers and the locals approached each other gradually, leaving space for the land between them. Both groups moved with care, guided not by fear, but by the shared understanding that encounters shape futures. No words were exchanged, language would fail here. Instead, they offered objects, a bundle of dried leaves, a shaped stone, a woven strand, a carved wooden tool. Simple gifts, clear intentions, mutual curiosity. After the exchange, the 2 groups parted gently, neither lingering nor rushing. The meeting was brief but significant, like a ripple expanding across still water. The travelers continued westward, feeling the world opening further with each step. They crossed streams where water ran clear and cold. They climbed hills that revealed valleys as wide as oceans. They rested under trees older than memory. Every direction offered something new, different bird song, unfamiliar scents, distinct patterns in the soil. They saw a herd of massive animals grazing peacefully, thick fur, broad shoulders, slow movements that shook the earth with each step. They found a plateau overlooking a distant river, far wider and deeper than the one that guided them from home. They touched stones shaped by wind rather than water, covered in ancient lichen. The horizon was no longer a boundary, it was an invitation.
As dusk began to settle, painting the land in gold and purple tones, the travelers made camp beneath a cluster of trees on a small ridge. From there, they watched the sun sink behind mountains they had only just discovered. Silence wrapped around them, not the silence of warning, but the silence of awe. The elder whispered that the world was larger than any single life could know. The hunters felt humility in the vastness spreading before them. The gatherers felt purpose in the plants they had found, each one carrying secrets of healing or nourishment. The land had grown enormous, but they did not feel lost, they felt expanded. As stars emerged, one by one at first, then spilling across the sky, the group lay on soft grass, breathing in cool air. Crickets began their steady rhythm. An owl hooted from a distant branch. The wind brushed through leaves with a long, slow sigh. They realized that their footsteps were part of something larger, paths that others before them had taken, paths that others after them would follow. By morning, when the first light crept across the ridge, the travelers rose with calm purpose. They stood quietly, absorbing the horizon stretching before them. They didn't know exactly where they would go next. They didn't need to. The land would guide them, as it always had. Their footsteps would continue to spread across meadows, hills, and riverbanks, expanding their understanding of the world and weaving their presence gently into its ancient fabric. They turned eastward, where home waited. Their journey back would not be the same as their arrival. They carried new knowledge, new impressions, new memories shaped by landscapes beyond anything they had imagined. The horizon no longer felt distant. It felt alive, breathing, shifting, welcoming. And when they finally returned to their community, their steps merging again into familiar soil, they carried the quiet strength of discovery within them. Their footsteps had spread far, but the world offered endless paths, still waiting silently beneath the sky.
The world beyond their valley had opened like a vast, unbroken tapestry, and when the travelers finally returned home, carrying memories of distant meadows and silent encounters with other communities, the people welcomed them with quiet gratitude. There was no celebration, no loud gathering. Their return folded into the rhythm of daily life like a gentle stitch threading into cloth. Yet something had shifted. The land felt deeper, larger, filled with more stories than they had imagined, and the community, softly, began to change alongside it. Before, they had lived moment to moment, guided by seasons, silence, and necessity. Their days flowed with instinct, their choices shaped by survival. But discovery, even in its calmest form, leaves marks that do not fade. Now the community sensed possibilities where before they had only sensed limits. Their journeys had shown them, slowly, quietly, that life could expand in many directions, and that meaning grew not only from the land itself, but from the rituals people shaped around it. These rituals did not appear suddenly. They grew like roots, small at first, hidden beneath the soil, spreading slowly until one day they rose into the open world. The first new tradition formed around evening gatherings. Before the journey, the community sat by the fire mostly to share warmth or listen to elders speak. But now the gathering felt different. The fire became a center, not just of heat, but of memory. Each evening, as orange flames flickered and shadows moved softly across the ground, people brought small things they had found during the day: a smooth stone, a feather, a dried leaf, a carved piece of wood. These were placed in a circle near the fire, forming a growing collection of simple objects that held unspoken significance. The children were the first to ask questions. Why was this stone special today? Who brought this leaf? What did this feather mean? At first, adults answered only in gestures, smiles, nods, soft words. But gradually, each object earned a story. Not grand tales, but small reflections: where it was found, why it felt important, what it reminded someone of. These stories became gentle markers of their days, helping the community remember that even the quietest moments held meaning. This became an evening ritual, unplanned yet steady. The small circle near the fire grew. Objects rotated and drifted back to the land, replaced by new ones. The ritual had no formal name, no rules. It was a simple exchange between the day and the night. Another tradition began taking shape as well, something born from the silent journeys the travelers had taken across hills and meadows. They had returned with imprints of landscapes etched into their minds. The way wind moved across tall grass, the curve of distant streams, the shape of unfamiliar footprints on soft earth. As they shared these impressions quietly in conversation, people began sketching them in the soil with sticks. At first, it was only lines in the dirt: a bend of a river, a rise of hills, the pattern of trees in a new grove. But soon, those lines became more thoughtful. They added marks for animal trails, the places where water tasted sweet, the spots where sunlight filtered through leaves in a particular way. These soil drawings faded with wind or rain, but they reappeared often, drawn from memory, adjusted, reshaped, retold. They were not maps, they were reflections, land remembered in quiet gestures. Over time, children began joining this habit. They sketched the world as they saw it: rivers as long swirls, mountains as rising curves,
trees as clusters of marks, animals as simple outlines. Adults didn't correct them. They watched these drawings with a tenderness that came from understanding something deeper. The land was becoming a shared memory, carried not just by those who traveled, but by the entire community. This practice created a new rhythm in their days. Each morning, before beginning daily tasks, someone, often a child, would draw a simple shape in the dirt, something representing what they hoped to find or understand that day. A pattern of leaves, the direction of wind, a symbol for a specific animal. These drawings were not instructions, but invitations. They reminded everyone that life unfolded not with force, but with gentle intention. Soon, another tradition emerged, guided by the river. The river had always been a source of water, food, and direction. But after the long journey, the settlers began to see it differently. The river had connected them not only to new land, but to other people, other stories, other ways of living. So the elders suggested something simple but meaningful. Each person would visit the river at least once a day in silence, not to gather water or fish, but simply to listen. This became known, quietly, without naming it, as the river's moment. People visited at different times: at dawn, when mist floated above the surface; at midday, when sunlight shimmered like scattered gold; in late afternoon, when the water darkened into deep blues; in the evening, when the current whispered under moonlight. Some stood at the bank, letting their breath align with the water's flow. Some crouched, touching the surface lightly with their fingertips. Some sat on rocks, letting the river speak in its soft, timeless voice. This daily visit deepened their connection to the land and to each other. Without discussing it, each person carried fragments of the river's calm back to the community. Fewer disputes arose. Decisions were made with gentler consideration. People rested more easily at night. The river's rhythm became part of them.
With time, new ways of marking the passage of days began to appear. The settlers had no calendars, no carved symbols to count time, but they had seasons, cycles, and subtle shifts in the world. A young mother began noticing the phases of the moon, how its shape changed nightly, how its light influenced the river's shimmer. She taught her child to observe the moon's curve, and soon others joined. The moon's phases became soft markers of time, not instructions, just reminders. A full moon meant gatherings later into the night. A crescent moon meant early rest. A dark moon reminded them to prepare their shelters for the coming chill or rain. This unspoken observance blossomed into something gentle, a new way of sensing time through night sky rhythms. Alongside this, the travelers brought back stories of the distant communities they had met, not stories of confrontation or mystery, but moments of quiet connection, shared gestures, exchanged objects, subtle signs of mutual understanding. These stories planted seeds of a new tradition as well, an offering space. Near the edge of the forest, where roots gripped the soil tightly, they made a small platform of flat stones. Each person placed something there occasionally: a shaped twig, a grain of dried fruit, a feather, a bead made of clay, a polished pebble. They left these not for themselves, but for whoever might pass by, human or otherwise. Sometimes the offerings remained untouched for days. Sometimes new objects appeared beside them, placed by unseen hands. No one questioned who left them. No one claimed ownership. This quiet exchange became a ritual of trust. Trust in the land, trust in those sharing it, trust in the unseen connections that linked distant lives. Slowly, these traditions layered themselves into daily existence, shaping the community in ways as gentle as falling leaves, as steady as flowing water.
Even their way of eating transformed. Meals had once been simple: gather what survived winter, share what was hunted, cook what was caught. But after their journeys, mealtimes became moments of reflection. They sat in smaller groups, sharing food without hurry. They waited until everyone had something before beginning. Children served elders first. The hunters gave the best portions to those who could not hunt. Gatherers offered berries carefully sorted, herbs placed thoughtfully. Food became not just nourishment, but gratitude made visible. And as traditions rooted themselves deeper, the community discovered another subtle change. Storytelling softened. The stories they told were no longer only about hardship or the past. They became stories about the land itself, the patterns of wind, the meanings in silence, the mystery of distant valleys, the lessons learned from river stones and mountain shadows. Some evenings, a child would begin a story with only a few quiet words. Adults would add to it gently, weaving their experiences into the same thread. The story would grow until it belonged to everyone, shaped by many voices, but carried by the same calm rhythm. These were not lessons or warnings. They were a way of understanding the world together. The slow birth of these traditions didn't reshape the community all at once. It shaped them the way moss grows on stone, softly, steadily, until one day you cannot imagine the stone without the moss. Traditions became the quiet structure beneath their lives. They marked the passing of seasons. They preserved memories without needing carvings. They taught children not through commands, but through presence. They connected the community to other people without needing words. They wove life into the land and the land into life. As time unfolded, these traditions didn't make the settlers feel more important. They made them feel more connected. The rituals helped them understand that they were threads in a much larger fabric, one woven by countless seasons, shaped by water and stone, carried by wind and silence. Their footsteps had spread beyond the horizon. Their memories had blended with the land's deeper memory. And now their traditions, soft, slow, natural, began to anchor them in a way nothing else could. These traditions were not created to last forever. They were created simply to live, each day, each season, each breath. And the land, ancient and patient, held them gently as they unfolded.
The land carried memories long before any traveler set foot upon it. Winds swept across valleys and hills, carrying whispers of seasons that had come and gone. The river wore stories into its stones, shaping smooth surfaces that reflected not just sunlight, but ancient time. Trees held centuries within their rings, woven silently into their trunks. The earth itself was an archive, quiet, patient, always listening. And over time, the lives of the settlers became part of that archive, layer upon layer, pressed gently into the fabric of the world. Their lives were not marked by noise or monuments. They built no towering structures. They carved no declarations into stone. They did not claim the land with boundaries or walls. Instead, they left traces so subtle, so woven into the natural rhythm, that anyone who followed long after them would not always know the origins, but would feel the presence. What they left behind began with the land itself. Paths formed where their footsteps had once tread, not carved with tools, not flattened by heavy loads, just softened by repeated passage. Grass bent slightly differently on those routes, forming faint trails through meadows and along riversides. Over years, these paths became gentle lines across the land, used by animals, reshaped by wind, and eventually followed by later wanderers who sensed the ease of walking where others had walked before. These paths did not lead to specific destinations. They led to understanding, to water, to forest, to safety, to places the settlers once found important, not because the land belonged to them, but because they belonged to it. The stone circles they had visited, or built without ever calling them constructions, became another quiet legacy. Near the riverbank, the circle where offerings had been placed remained long after the individuals who began it had turned to memory. Wind and rain shifted the stones, moss crept across their surfaces, but the formation endured. Travelers who arrived generations later found the stones and felt something they could not name, an invitation, perhaps, or a reminder that connection did not start with them. In forests where the settlers had gathered herbs and roots, they left small indicators of what was safe to consume. Not signs or marks, but patterns, the way certain plants grew more abundantly near the edges of footpaths, the subtle thinning of poisonous species where they had been avoided, the flourishing of edible ones where seeds had fallen from baskets over time. These natural arrangements became unwritten guides for those who wandered the land later. What they left behind was not intentional, it was the result of living gently.
The river carried pieces of them as well, not objects, but presence. The stones they once touched, the banks they once rested upon, the places where they learned to listen. These spots held a distinct energy. Later travelers who sat by the river would feel a strange sense of calm without knowing why. The river is remembered not through words, but through the steady shaping of its flow around the places where the settlers once knelt, once washed, once paused to let their breath align with water. The stories they created, spoken softly beside small fires, floated into the night and settled into the land. They were not loud stories that demanded to be remembered. They were quiet stories that asked only to be carried forward in feeling. Those stories changed form over time, woven unconsciously into the patterns of people who came after. Some stories became part of the way new travelers greeted the river. Others shaped the way they watched the sky. Some lived in the way children of later generations taught their young to walk gently on earth. Their traditions, though simple, became threads in a larger fabric. The daily visit to the river became instinct for many who lived there generations later, even among those who never knew where the ritual began. People stood by its edge, not out of necessity, but out of a sense of peace inherited from those early settlers. They pressed their hands into the water, felt its coolness, and allowed silence to hold them. They did not know they were continuing something ancient. They only knew the river asked for their attention. The subtle drawings made in soil, those lines representing hills, valleys, and the quiet flow of time, became gestures carried forward unknowingly. Long after the first settlers were gone, children in new communities traced marks in the dirt, shaping symbols without understanding the echoes behind them. Adults often smiled at these drawings, unaware that they were participating in a tradition far older than their memory. The offerings placed on stones for unseen travelers continued in unexpected ways. Newcomers left tokens of gratitude near the same cluster of roots without knowing who had done so before them. A polished pebble, a dried flower, a carved stick. The stones slowly accumulated evidence of countless lives overlapping, each generation contributing something small. The origins were forgotten, but the spirit remained. Their quiet way of moving through the land became the land's way of shaping those who followed. People learned to walk with respectful steps, not from instruction, but from the way the world itself responded. Animals approached more calmly. Winds shifted gently through trees. The river's voice flowed steadily. Silence became a companion rather than a void. This quiet relationship with the world echoed across time, passed from one generation to another without ever being spoken directly. Their shelters did not last. Built from wood and leaves, woven with reeds and earth,
they returned to the land within a few seasons. Trees absorbed the wood, water softened the reeds, earth reclaimed the soil. If someone walked there decades later, they would see no walls, no roofs, no marks of habitation. Yet something remained, an unseen warmth, a gentle familiarity in the clearing, as if people who lived there long ago still breathed in its air. Those who came later often chose the same places to rest, as if guided by instinct. They sat in the same patches of sunlight. They built fires where fires had burned before. They slept under the same stars and felt strangely safe in places shaped by the presence of others. Safety, too, was something the settlers left behind. Their careful observation of the land, how to avoid danger, how to sense storms before they arrived, how to read the sky, became part of the land's own memory. Birds changed their flight patterns in areas kept peaceful by generations of quiet human presence. Animals settled more comfortably in nearby trees and meadows. The land adjusted itself around human softness, creating pockets of harmony that continued long after the original settlers were gone. Even silence itself carried their legacy. Those who came after found themselves quiet when walking through the valley, not because they were afraid, but because the land suggested quiet. The wind hushed at certain corners. Leaves rustled softly. The river spoke in whispers rather than roars. Travelers mirrored this calm without knowing why. Silence became tradition.
There were also deeper legacies, ones invisible but powerful. Over generations, the way the settlers cared for the land shaped the land's resilience. Places they harvested respectfully grew back stronger. Areas where they gathered water thoughtfully remained pure. Zones where they avoided overhunting became homes for diverse wildlife. The land thrived because it had once been lived in with intention, patience, and humility. Those who came later benefited without ever knowing the reason. They lived in a valley healthier and more capable of supporting life because others had walked gently before them. And perhaps the greatest legacy was this: they taught the land how to welcome. The first settlers had come across endless waters, exhausted, uncertain, and afraid. Yet they approached the world with sensitivity, listening rather than forcing, observing rather than claiming, adapting rather than imposing. They treated the land not as a resource, but as a companion. The land responded. It softened. It opened. It offered what it could. Generations later, newcomers would enter the valley and feel an inexplicable sense of belonging. They did not know that this welcome was shaped by those early people, by the care they had shown, by the balance they had created. The land remembered kindness the way stone remembers pressure, the way water remembers shape. Among the hills and meadows, there were places where someone who had never been there before might suddenly feel at home. They might sit beneath a tree and sense a calm that had been shaped by ancient fires. They might drink from the river and feel the presence of someone who once knelt in that same spot. They might walk through the forest and find their steps guided by paths formed from footsteps that had long faded. What the settlers left behind was not a legacy built in stone or words. It was something quieter, deeper, more enduring. They left behind a world shaped by gentleness, a land softened by respect, a valley where silence carried wisdom and footsteps carried memory. And for all those who came after, travelers, wanderers, families, tribes, the world felt just a little safer, a little kinder, a little more like a place that welcomed life rather than resisted it. Their lives became part of the land's heartbeat, echoing softly beneath the surface in a rhythm that continued long after their names and stories were forgotten by human voices. The land remembered everything, and in its memory, their presence never truly faded. The valley that had once held only the soft footsteps of a few weary travelers had, over time, become something far greater than any one life could measure. What began as survival had grown into understanding. What began as wandering had turned into belonging. And without realizing it, those early settlers, quiet in their habits, gentle in their movements, attentive in their learning, had shaped the foundation of a world that future generations would inherit long after their own voices faded into the wind. Their influence was not carved into monuments or etched into tablets. It pulsed in quieter ways, woven into the land's memory and carried forward by those who came later. The settlers never imagined themselves as founders. They simply lived with respect, listening to rivers, watching the patterns of wind, building footsteps that blended with the earth instead of pressing against it. In doing so, they laid down the earliest threads of a way of life that would echo through countless seasons. Their patience became a lesson the land never forgot. Later groups who entered the valley found that animals responded calmly, that water remained pure, that the soil grew generous. They sensed safety without knowing its origins. This sense of trust shaped how they approached the world, less with conquest, more with coexistence. The settlers' quiet choices became silent teachers. Their traditions, too, endured in ways they never planned. When people gathered near fires in the evening, sharing stories in low voices, they continued a rhythm first formed by those early travelers who once sat in circles, letting the night shape their thoughts. When children drew patterns in the soil, representing rivers and hills in simple lines, they unknowingly carried forward a habit born from the settlers who charted the land with gestures instead of maps. When strangers exchanged small objects, feathers, stones, woven fibers, this unspoken gesture linked back to the first cautious meetings between wandering groups who learned to understand one another without words. What they left behind were not customs, but instincts. Even silence became part of the inheritance. Generations later, people stepping through the valley would lower their voices without understanding why. They would walk softly beneath trees, pausing to listen to the whisper of leaves. They would approach water with a sense of reverence, feeling the river's presence rather than merely using it. In this silence, future communities found wisdom, learning that listening revealed more than speaking ever could. Over years, as more people arrived, settled, left, and returned, the land became a tapestry of countless lives. But woven through every thread was the influence of those first quiet settlers. Their way of living shaped how newcomers understood the land, not as territory to be claimed, but as a companion to be respected. This understanding guided how they hunted, how they traveled, how they raised their young. In this subtle way, the settlers shaped not just a community, but the early breath of something larger, something that would one day stretch far beyond valleys and rivers, touching forests, plains, and distant coasts. Their quiet values, sharing, listening, patience, coexistence, became the earliest seeds of cooperation between different groups. These seeds would grow slowly, shifting with seasons, changing shape with generations, but always rooted in the same gentle origins. They never set out to build a future nation. They never imagined the expanse of life that would grow from their footsteps. But their choices, humble, quiet, respectful, became the first soft notes of a vast story yet to unfold. Long after their shelters returned to earth, long after their names were forgotten, the memory of their way of life continued shaping those who walked the same soil. Their journey was never meant to be heroic or grand. It was simply human, and yet, in that simplicity, they formed the calm, enduring foundation of a world waiting to be born, one shaped not by noise or force, but by the gentle strength of those who knew how to listen.